Hi there, welcome to the Web Schools. In this video, you will learn HTML and CSS in under 4 hours. It is not required to have any prior knowledge. We're gonna start from the absolute beginning, and by the end of this video, you will be very comfortable working with HTML and CSS. We're gonna build a website together that has all the most important elements used in web development. I just want to remind you that this is just a small fraction of my complete course that you can find on Udemy. I'm leaving a link in the description of this video where you can get this course with the promotional discount. In this course, you have 27 hours of content in more than 150 lessons. You will learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript, jQuery, and Vue.js. All these technologies in just one course. Just click on the link on the description of this video and get the price today with the promotional discount to learn all these technologies and kickstart your front-end web developer career. Alright, without further ado, let's jump right into the free HTML and CSS course. Hey there, in this video, we're gonna start writing the first lines of code of our website. In order to do that, we need a text editor. In theory, any text editor would be sufficient for us to write our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, but in order to boost our productivity, it's better that we use a text editor that is dedicated to web development. The most popular ones are Sublime Text 3, Notepad++, and Visual Studio Code. The one I use the most is Visual Studio Code, and this is the one I'm going to use in this course. If you already use another text editor, that's completely fine. If you don't have one yet, I suggest you download Visual Studio Code. So for that, you can just go to Google Chrome, then type Visual Studio Code. If you see the blue icon, that's the one we're looking for. As you can see, the URL is code.visualstudio.com. I'm using Windows, so I can just click on this button. If you are looking for versions for other operating systems, you can click on the arrow down and choose the correct one for you. So let's just click here, and the download is going to start. While you wait, there's a little tutorial here if you want to get to know more about Visual Studio Code. When the download finishes, we can click to open the installer. Let's accept the agreement, click next, and then I think it's good to select this option to create a desktop icon so we can have quick access. Just click next, and then you can click install. I'm not going to do this now because I already have Visual Studio Code. Once you're done with the installation, you should have a shortcut added to your desktop, so you can just double click on it to open. And this is the first screen that you are going to see. We have a few options here like start a new file or open an existing file. The best way to manage a project for a website is by opening a folder. So before we do that, let's create one. So I'm just going to minimize Visual Studio Code. I'm going to right click on my desktop and choose new folder. I'm going to name this HTML and CSS course. Inside this folder, I'm going to create another folder for our first project. So I'm just going to go to new folder. And I'm just going to name it project 1. So now we can just minimize this folder, go back to Visual Studio Code, and now we can choose the open folder option. Let's go to the desktop. So here's the folder we just created. Instead of double clicking the project 1 folder, we can just select it like this and then click the select folder button. This left side panel is the folder we just created, and inside here we can create files and folders so we can start writing the code for our project. So the first file I'm going to create is the HTML file, so we can start adding the content to our website. So I'm just going to click this icon to create a new file. Let's name this index.html. You can choose any name you want, but this is the convention for the front page of a website. So if we upload our files, everything that is inside the index.html will be the content of the front page by default. So let's choose index.html. And if we go back to the folder we just created, so let's go inside project 1, you will see that we just created an HTML file. I can see the Google Chrome icon because this is the default program to open this type of file. If you don't see this icon, I suggest you right-click on the file and choose Open With. Then go to Choose Another App. And then you can choose the browser of your preference, and you can select Always use this app to open HTML files. Let's click OK. And now, by default, we're going to open every HTML file we create using Google Chrome. Let me close this tab. So just to make a first test, let's write something inside this HTML file like testing. Let's save this by pressing Ctrl S or Command S on Mac, or go into File, Save. But I prefer to use the shortcut because we're going to be doing this a lot, so it's always better to use the Ctrl S shortcut. And now you can press Alt Tab or Command Tab on Mac to go to the other window. And if we refresh the page, we can click here, but again, it's faster if we use the shortcut to refresh the page, which is F5. So if we press F5, we can see that now the content that we wrote inside our HTML file is showing here on the web browser. So now that we took this first step, it's time to learn how to write the basic structure of HTML files. And this is what we're going to learn in the next video. I'll see you then. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to speak about the basic structure of an HTML document. In order for the browser to interpret our code and render the web page correctly, we need to follow some rules. So let's erase this. If you're using Visual Studio Code, you can type HTML. Then these suggestions will appear on the side. You can just use the arrow keys to choose HTML5 and press Enter. And this is the fastest way to start an HTML document. For this first lesson, however, I'm not going to use the shortcut because I want you to get comfortable writing the HTML tags yourself. So let's press Ctrl Z to go back, and let's write the basic structure ourselves. HTML tags are elements we declare using these less than and greater than symbols. So let's start with the HTML element. This is the start tag of this element, and now we need to write an end tag. When we start typing, Visual Studio Code will suggest the end tag, so we can just type enter, and this is an HTML element. We can break a few lines, and now we're going to start adding things inside here. With this element, we're telling the browser that all information and content of our web page will be inside here. Everything placed outside of this HTML tag, let's say we broke a few lines after it and wrote some things down here, everything placed outside will either be ignored or might not work as expected. Now we're going to start having elements inside elements. The HTML element still needs two important sections, which are the head and the body. So let's include them. In the beginning, we were writing these symbols ourselves, but on Visual Studio Code, you don't even have to do that. You can just type the name of the element. So let's type head. Let's pick the right suggestion, which in this case is the head. Let's press enter. And now Visual Studio Code typed the start and the end tag for us. We just need to break one line. Here it is. And now let's open the body. Again, press enter. So here's the head and here's the body of this HTML document. Since these two are inside the HTML element, let's select them and use the tab key to add a margin. This space we added is also called indentation, and it's very important to do this right from the start to keep your code easy to read and maintain. So with this, we can clearly see that the HTML element starts here and ends here, and these are its child elements. Now, what is the role of these two elements? The head will carry important information about the HTML document, like the title. So let's press tab, let's open a title tag, and let's write something like my first website. You can do it like this, or if you prefer, you can break one line. If you think this is easier to read, when I have just a small piece of content like this, I like to leave it in the same line. It makes no difference to the web browser. The important thing is that we started the tag here, we ended the tag, and inside it we have the content of it. Now the body element will contain all visible content of our web page. So let's write, this is the visible content of our web page. Let's remove the extra spaces. And now we're almost done with the basic structure. There's just one last thing that we need to add for now at the top, which is what HTML version we're using. For this, we're going to use the doc type declaration, which starts with an exclamation mark and is normally written in caps. So doc type. And now we need to tell the HTML version we are going to use. Previous versions of HTML required us to declare a URL for the version, something more or less like this. Now with HTML5, which is the standard version in use, we don't need that anymore. We just type HTML, and this is the declaration for HTML5. Now we can make sure that the browser will read this document correctly. And that's it. We don't have to close the doc type, and actually the doc type is not a tag. It's just a declaration to tell the browser the type of document and version we're using. Alright, we still have a few more things to add here, but first, let's see how this looks on the browser. Let's save with Ctrl S, go back there, Alt Tab, and now refresh the page with F5, and here it is. Note that what we wrote inside the title tag in the head section shows up here on the tab's title. And everything we write inside the body will show on the page. Okay, so we are ready to move forward and start adding content to our page. That's what we're going to do in the next video. See you! Hey there, in the previous video we created our first HTML file and we were able to open it in the web browser. We added a title which we can see up here on the tab's name, and we also added some content to the body element, and this content is visible in the web browser. Now it's time to start working on our first project, which I have right here. So this is the project that we are going to work on in this first section. It's a very simple web page, but there are many of the most important fundamentals of HTML and CSS for you to learn. So here we have a very simple top bar. Then we have something we call the hero image. So normally these banners that we have on the top of websites, they are called hero banners. Then we have sort of a blog post page. So here we have the title of the blog post, the author. Here we have the body text. You are also going to learn how to create buttons like this one with this effect when we hover the cursor over it. Then we have a list of links and a subscription form, followed by a simple footer. So as you can see, the page is super simple, but when we finish with this project, you are going to be very comfortable writing code in HTML and CSS. So let's get started with this. We're going to continue with the page we already had. So let's just go back to Visual Studio Code. Before we get started, there are two things that we need to include here. Let's remember that if you want to start your files with the HTML structure ready, you can use the shortcut that Visual Studio Code had. So if we didn't have anything and we just typed HTML, we could choose HTML5, and right here we would have the basic structure of it. So I'm just going to hit Ctrl Z so we can write it ourselves. So the first thing we are going to do is adding the language our page is on. This is an important information that we need to declare, and we are going to do this through an attribute. So with HTML elements, let's remember that this is the opening tag of the HTML element. This is the closing tag, and everything in between is the content of the HTML element. And we can also add stuff right next to the name on the opening tag. And these are called attributes. Attributes are information about the element. So in this case, we're going to tell the browser that this HTML document is written in English. So we can add an attribute called lang. And the way we use attributes is by adding an equal sign, and then between quotation marks, we can insert the value we want. In this case is the language. So the code is N for English. And now we are going to add another element here inside the head, which is the character set. This is going to be important to make sure that all the characters we type will be rendered correctly, including not only the text, but also any symbols we use on the page. So let's add a meta element. This element won't have a closing tag. This is because it has no content, it only has attribute. So we don't need to close the meta element. The attribute that we are going to add is the char set. And we are going to use UTF-8, which is the one that is going to include pretty much all the alphabets in all languages in the world, plus all the symbols. So with this character set, we make sure that everything we use on our page in terms of letters and symbols will be rendered correctly by the browser. Okay, let's save this. Now I'm going to open a file that has all the text content of our page. You can copy all this text right below this video. So I'm just going to copy everything to save time. This is only the text content of the page. So now let's include inside the body. Let me break a few lines, and now I'm just going to paste everything I have here. Let me just select everything and press Tab to add indentation. Now things are organized. So this is exactly the content that we should see on our page. Coming back to the browser, to the complete version, you see that this is the content for the top bar, and then we have the title of the article and the text and everything. So all of these things are now in the page. Let's save this and let's see what happens. So save this. Let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh the page with F5. And as you can see, this is looking very strange. And this is because we just pasted all the text. And what happens, let's go back to Visual Studio Code, is that HTML does not read more than one space. So here we can see the spaces between words. But if we add a lot of spaces and a lot of line breaks, and save this, we can see that there's no difference because HTML is only going to read one space and it's not going to read line breaks. So there are a few rules we need to follow to tell the browser when we want to break lines, how we want to structure the content of our web page, and also how do we want to style each of the elements. Because if we go back here, we can see that we have different font sizes, background colors. So the way we are going to style all these things is by starting with the correct HTML elements. And this is what we're going to do in the next video. And now that we have all the content here, in the next video, you're going to learn the HTML5 semantic elements so we structure the content of our web page. I'll see you then. Hello, in this video we're going to start separating the content of our page, and for that we need to speak about HTML5 semantic elements. Let's go to Google and let's search for HTML5 semantic elements. You can just go to this first result, which is for W3 schools. I really like this website to learn more about any HTML topic. So what is a semantic element? Well, in HTML, we can use elements like divs and spans to separate content, but these elements, they tell nothing about the content they have inside. On the other hand, semantic elements will tell the browser what is our intention when we create them. And this is going to be much better for the search engines like Google or Bing to interpret your page and to make it searchable. So here's an example of how we could structure our page. We could have the first section inside the header element, and then we could have a navigation. In our example, we don't have a navigation, so we are not going to use this one for now. And then we can have sections. We can have an article. We're going to speak with more detail about each of these elements, but basically these are the most important HTML5 semantic elements. If you go down, you see a brief explanation of each of them. Let's go to our example, and then it's going to be clear in which situations we use each of these elements. So going back to Visual Studio Code, for the first section, which is that blue top bar, we can use the header element. So everything at the top, including the navigation, could be included inside the header. So you see that we're going to start having nested elements. For this example, we don't have the navigation. It is just that top bar. So we can add it inside the header element. Let's select this, press Alt and the arrow key up to move it inside. And now we are telling the browser that this is the header of our page. Like I was saying, before the HTML5 semantic elements, it was very common to just use divs for everything, just like that. So we would have a div, which is used to separate content, but in this case, we're not telling the browser and the search engines anything about this element. If we use the semantic element otherwise, it is clear that this is the header section of our page. So this is why it's important to use the correct elements. Now let's create an element for the article. Normally when we have a blog post, we're going to use the article element to contain all the content of the blog post. So let's start an article element. We are going to move everything except the footer inside this article element. So let's select everything excluding the list of links and the footer. So this, I'm going to leave this as part of the footer as well, including that subscribe form that we have. So you can use Alt and the arrow keys, or you can press Ctrl X to cut and then just paste everything inside here. Let's see the indentation, it's correct. We can see that everything is inside the article element. Remember, you can collapse and expand these elements if you want to see your page better. So right now it's starting to get more organized. We can close these and we can see that we have a header, we have an article, and now let's add the footer element. And let's place all the content of the footer inside. Let's save this. And now we have the header, we have the article section and the footer section. Now we can open the article again and continue to separate the content. So going back to the final project, let's remember that the first thing that we are going to have at the top here is the hero image. So let's have a section for that inside the article. Let's add a section element. We don't have the image yet, so we can just type something like image place holder. So this is where we are going to place the image for the hero section. And then we can add a main element, which is for the main content of the page. If you go back here, let's search for main, so Control F. So we can see that it specifies the main content of a document, which in this case is going to be our blog post. So let's add it right here. We are telling the browser that this is the main content of our page. So all the content of the blog post will be inside the main element. So now we have another section here. And if we save this now and go back there, you will see that there's not a lot of difference yet. We separated the content, so we can see that now this part at the top is here. Then we have the image placeholder, but we're still not seeing the content of the page very well. And this is because we also need to separate each of the elements. So if we go to the documentation, you can go to HTML elements, and here you have the most basic HTML elements. We can start with headings and paragraphs. So for all the text of our blog post, we are going to tell the browser what are the headings of that blog post. So going back to the final version, this is the most important heading because this is the title. You can see that the font is bigger. So for this one, we are going to use the age 1. We have 6 levels of headings. So we have from age 1 to age 6. And this is how we are going to tell the browser the importance of each of them and the font sizes we want. Of course, we can change them later, but the browser will have default font sizes for each of the headings. So this one is age 1, and here we can probably use age 2 for each of these, and P for the paragraphs. So let's go back there and do this now. So this is the age 1, which is the most important title of the page. Then right here, we can use the div element. You can also use the section, but I prefer to use the section for the most relevant sections. For just small elements like this one, I like to still use the div. So here's the div to separate this part of the content. And now we have a few age 2s here. So one is this. So as you can see, sometimes I break lines and sometimes I just put everything on the same line. This depends on the amount of content I have. In this case, I just have 2 words. So in these situations, I prefer to just leave it on one line. But when I have like a sentence or more sentences, then I prefer to break lines like this. It's really up to you. There's no rule about this. As long as if you decide to break lines, you leave things with indentation, just like I did here, it's all fine. Okay, so now we have a few paragraphs. This is one paragraph. Then we have another one. If you want to break lines like this, just so you can read it better, that's fine. You don't have to do that because remember that the HTML will ignore these line breaks. But if you want just to organize your content better, you can do this. Now we have another age 2 for this subtitle. And we have a few more paragraphs. So this is one. This is another. Now right here we have a list. I'm just going to use a paragraph for now, and then later we can replace it by the right element for lists. So now we have all the content inside the right elements. We are telling the browser what are our intentions for each of them. So now this should look a bit better. If we save this and we go back to the browser, let's refresh the page. And now as you can see, it's starting to look much better. Now the browser understands what we want for each of these elements. So we have a section up here, then we have an age one for the title of this post. Then we have a few paragraphs and subtitles. So as you can see, even without any styles, now it's much easier to understand the content of this page. Alright, so in the next video, we are going to add the image for the hero section, and then we are going to speak about lists, so we can have the two lists that we have on the page, so we can eventually get to this result. I'll see you in the next video. Hi there, in this video, we're going to add the hero image and also the two lists that we have on our page. So one is this one with the bullet points, and the other one is this list of links. Both of them are specific HTML elements used for lists. So in this video, we're going to cover these topics. So let's get started with the image. We just left a placeholder for it. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. It is right here. So it's very simple to add images to your web page. All you have to do is using the EMG element. So as you can see, it has no closing tag because it's not going to have any content. The way we tell the browser which image we want to use is with the source attribute. So right here, we can just type the path of the image file. We can go back to the projects folder, which is this one, and you can add folders and files from here. But you can also do that from Visual Studio Code, at least creating the folder structure. So if you click this button at the top left, you will see the folder structure. Right now, we only have the root folder for the project and one HTML file. So here, we're just going to add a new folder with this second button here. We can name this images. It's a good practice to separate your image into a separate folder so you don't mix them with the HTML files. And now we're just going to paste the image for the hero. Right below this video, you will see a link for you to download this image. I already downloaded them, so I'm just gonna go to the images folder and I'm gonna paste the images here. So as you can see, let me just switch the view to large icons. We have the image for the hero section, and we also have the social network links that we're going to add later. All right, so relatively to the root folder, which is where our HTML file is on, the path for the image is going to be images / and then the file name. So in the source, if we add images / then Visual Studio Code is giving us the suggestions with the files we have inside. We can just choose the mountain one and then press enter. It's important that you either use these Visual Studio Code suggestions or you really go to the folder and just copy the name like this. This is better than typing it yourself to avoid typos. Sometimes you can type things a bit differently, or even using different capital letters could cause the image not to show. So it's a good practice to always come here and copy the file name or use the suggestions from Visual Studio Code like I did. So we are already telling the browser which image file we want to use here. And this is the alt attribute, which is a basic description for this file. This is important for the search engines and also for screen readers. So we can just type something like hero image of mountains. We can save this. And if we go back to the browser and refresh the page, now we can see the image. It is very large now because the file is very large. We're going to resize it in a moment. For now, this is fine. So we can see that we are already starting to organize the page just like we have in the final project. So here we have the top header. Here we can see the top header, even though it's not center aligned, but we can see it's at the top here. And then we have an image, just like we have an image here. We're going to resize it in a moment. And then going down, we have the title of the page. So we are starting to get somewhere. Now, a quick fix that we can add to this image. This is not the best way of doing this. we are going to speak about how to style the image correctly, but for now, we can add the width attribute for the image, and then we could type stuff in pixels or in percentages. So let's start with pixels. So let's say we want this image to be 200 pixels wide instead of being that big. If we do this and go back to the page, we can see that now we have a very small image. We are telling the browser that the image has 200 pixels of width. So now it's not very large anymore. You could use other values like, let's say 500 pixels until it is the way you want it. Now it's a bit bigger, but the best thing would be to use percentage. So relatively to the page, we want the image to be 100%. So this means that the image is going to be from left to right of the page, taking 100% of its width, but it's not going to be larger than that. So this is the ideal width we can use for hero images. If we do this and go back there, now we can see that the image is taking 100% off the page. Even if we have this smaller, like this, it's always going to be resized for 100% of the page. Like I said, I don't like using the attributes to define the width of the images, but just for now, let's leave it like this. And when we start speaking about CSS, we're going to use the styles to define the width of the images. Okay, so now that we have our hero image, in the next video, we're going to add the two lists. I'll see you then. Hey there, in this video, we're going to add the two lists we have on our page. So the first one is this one in the middle of the body text of our blog post. So this is a list with bullet points, and we also have this list of links that doesn't have any bullet points, but it's also a list. So going to W3 Schools, if you go to HTML lists, you can see how this works. So we have unordered and ordered lists. In our page, we don't have any ordered lists, but if you wanted to use it, there is a specific HTML element for this. So let's see how do we use lists. As you can see, we have a fodder element, which is in this case the UL, which is for the unordered list, which is exactly the one we want. And then for each of the items in the list, we have a list item element. So let's do this on our page. Going back to Visual Studio Code, let's search for the list. Here it is. So inside the P element, you can put it inside or not. It's really up to you. In this case, since this is not a paragraph, this is just a list, I don't think we need this P element. So let's replace this by the UL element, which is the unordered list. Now for each of the elements, we're going to use a list item element. So let's just place it right here. And now I'm just going to copy the li element, the opening tag. Just going to paste it in each of the elements. Now let's move the closing tag to the end of this. You also have one for the etc. So let's save this. Let's see how this looks. Refreshing the page. Now, as you can see, we already have by default the bullet points. So this list is exactly the way we want it. And now we need to do the same thing for the list of links. So let's go back there and let's do the same thing. This is also going to be an unordered list. We don't have numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. But if we wanted to have numbers, we could just use the OL instead. So let's see how this looks now with the OL. And now we have numbers instead of the bullet points. And the good thing about using this is because sometimes you have these lists. Let's say we were typing things by hand, like 1, 2. If you decide to change the order of elements or delete one element, you have to update the numbers of all the items. But with the order list, it's going to do that for you automatically. So if we want to change, let's say, the order of this one, we want to place it in the position number 2. We don't have to do anything. We can just move things the way we want. And if we save this, now it's going to update the numbers for us. So this is why it's much better to use the ordered lists instead of typing the numbers manually. But this is not what we want for now. We just want an unordered list. And now let's go to the footer where we have the read more and then the list of links. To separate the read more, we can use like an age 3 because this is not exactly a paragraph. So let's use a heading for this, but less important than the age 2s. So this is an age 3. And now we're going to start an unordered list like we had above. Let me add some li. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 links. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's paste the titles inside of it. Okay, this is good. And now we just have this little all rights reserved section. We can use a section for this, or we can just use a div since it's just a very small piece of content. So now if we save this and go back to the page, now we have our list in the body text and we also have the list of links. And right below it, we have that footer bottom bar. Now we need to remove the bullet points, but this is something that we're not going to do now because we need to speak about styles and CSS first. But I just wanted to show you something. All the HTML and CSS of your page can be viewed in the dev tools of the browser. So if you right click your page and go to inspect, or you can also use the F12 shortcut, then you're going to open the dev tools. You can go to elements and then you'll be able to see all the HTML structure of your page. So let's open up the elements. Let's find that list that we included. So here it is. It's the UL. If you hover over it, you can see it being highlighted on the page on the left. So if I click this element, this UL, you will see that we have a few properties set by default. This is CSS. Even though we don't have any CSS and we didn't set any styles yet, all the HTML elements, they have some default styles. So this is why just by adding age 1s, age 2s, and Ps, we have different font sizes and font weights. This is because the elements, they have their default styles. And the same thing for lists. So the bullet points are set using a property called list style type. You can do any tests you want. You can add things using the inspector, but every time you refresh the page, you will lose everything you do here. So the inspector is just for testing purposes. So let's say we wanted to remove the bullet points of this list. We can use this button to select that element on the page. So let's just select the second list. Now I just selected the list item. Let's select the further unordered list. And now I can just test some style here, like list style type, and then I can set this to none. So as you can see, now we were able to remove the bullet points. And this is what we are going to do when we start using CSS. I just wanted to quickly show you this, but for now, we can just leave it as it was. And like I mentioned, everything you do in the inspector won't be saved. We are just testing things here. If you refresh the page, you'll see that you have the bullet points back. So if you want this to be permanent, you have to go to Visual Studio Code and add the CSS there. I just wanted to show you the inspector because we're going to be using this a lot from now on, so we can understand the structure of our page and do some tests before we actually write the code. But for now, I can just close it. And now we have the two lists we needed. The next step is to add some links. So if you go to the final project, you will see that we have some links here. So the author is a link. We could have links in the middle of the text. Maybe let's add one so we can test. We also have this list of links. So each of these items should take you somewhere. If this was a real page, this would take you to each of these blog posts. So this is what we're going to do in the next video. Bye bye. Hi there, in this video we're going to add links to our page. If we go to the final version, you will see that some things here are links, like the author name. We also have these two social media icons that are also links. This one is linking to LinkedIn and this one to Facebook. If we go down here, we also have this list of blog posts, and these are all link elements. If we go to W3 Schools, you can find HTML links. So this is how it works. We use an anchor tag, which is the A element, and the path for the link is going to be defined using the href attribute. So let's go back there and let's apply this to our page. So up here we have the author name, and here if you go back to the final version, you will see that the beginning of the text is not part of the link. So the by is not part of the link, just the author name. So let's do it exactly this way. So let's leave the by out of the link. So by doing this, the only part that is going to be a link is the author name. And let's include the href attribute, so we can define the path for this link. Here we need to add a complete URL. So let's say, for example, we just want to link this to Google's front page. Instead of just typing google.com, we need to type https://www.google.com. So the complete URL. Let's save this. Let's refresh the page to see what we have. So now, as you can see, we have a link on the author name. And if we click the link, we'll go to Google's web page. As you can see, it followed the link using the same tab. If you want to open links on different tabs, that's very easy to do. You can just add an attribute called target. So we have the href attribute, and we are also going to have another attribute called target. And you can use underscore blank. Don't ask me why. This is how we define it, but that's how HTML is. So underscore blank as the target. If you do this, and now let's refresh the page to see the changes. When we click the link, it just opens the link on a separate tab. So we still have our page right here. So normally if you have internal links to your website, let's say different pages of your website, you won't use the target blank because you don't want the user to be opening multiple tabs inside your website. But if you have external links like this, then maybe it's better to use the target blank, so then the user won't go away from your website. But that's up to you. I'm going to leave it like this for now. Now let's do the same thing for the second list. So we have a second list of links down here. I'm just going to copy the opening tag of each of the links. Just as an example, we can just leave everything to Google. That's fine. Now let's go to the second list, which is the list of links at the bottom. So here we have the unordered list, and we have each of the items. We can just wrap them inside the anchor tag. So I'm just going to paste it here for each of them. Don't forget to position the closing tag correctly. Ctrl X, let's paste it here. Same thing for the others. Okay, so now we have each of the list items inside links. So for this example, these would be other blog posts inside my own website. So I don't want the user to be opening multiple tabs. Whilst with the author name, it could be like an external link to a social media profile or something like that, or a LinkedIn profile. So let's save this. Let's go back to the page, refresh it. And now, as you can see, we have the author as a link, which is going to open on a separate page or on a separate tab because of the target attribute. and we have links that will open in the same tab. So if I click this link, it's going to open google.com, which is the path of the URL we defined. We can do the same thing in the body text. So going back there, if you want to add links to any of the words here, let's say I want to link this to the W3 schools documentation for HTML. That's very simple to do. We can just add the anchor tag like this. For this one, let's leave with the target blank. So I just wanted to link hypertext markup language -HTML. And let's maybe copy the URL for W3 schools. So copy. Let's use this as the href. Let's save this. And if we go back to the page now, we can see that now this part is a link. And if we click here, we can go to the documentation for HTML on a separate tab. Super cool. So now we know how to use links. The next thing we are going to add to our page is going to be the form. So below here we have the subscription form. This is actually an input field. So here we have the subscribe form. This is actually an input field for the email address and a button. And this is what we are going to do in the next video. I'll see you then. Hey there, in this video, we're going to add the subscription form. Let's go back to our page. And here in the HTML, let's go down to the footer. As you can see, we have this H3 for the read more. And the style is the same for the read more and the subscribe texts. So we can use the same tag, which is the H3. So right after the list, we can add an H3 for the subscribe text. And here we're going to start a form element. We're not going to need the action for now. This would be only if that form was working, was actually submitting something. Since this is just a static HTML page, our form is not going to be sending anything. That's just for learning purposes. So we can just use the form like this. Before we go ahead, let's go to W3 schools and let's find HTML forms. We can see it right in this second section here. So this is a basic form. Our form has only one field for the email address, but it's similar to this one. We're just going to have one field and then the submit button. If you go down, you will see more examples of fields. So we have a submit button, we have checkboxes, radio buttons, and all of these fields that are common on forms. If you go down here, you will see a few examples. So this is an example of a form using radio buttons. You can also have checkboxes. You have text fields like this. So yeah, if you want to read more, you can just spend some time here. For our example, we're just going to have something very similar to this. But it's even simpler than this because we won't have the label. We are just going to have the input field. If you see here, we don't have that label on top saying email address. We just have it inside the field. And I'm going to teach you how to add this placeholder in a moment. So for now, let's just copy the input. And now the type could be text, but if you use the type as email address, it's going to be easier to validate this field. So we can use the ID of email and same thing for the name. And here you can see that we have a BR element, which is a line break. Let's remember that HTML does not read line breaks. So when we want to add line breaks, we can use the BR element. So we could separate the form and the buttons with a BR, but in this case, this is not exactly what we want, because if you look at the original design, we have both on the same line. So let's just remove this BR, and here we can add the button, which is also going to be an input. So let's look for a button. Right here we have one. So as you can see, it's also an input field with the type of submit. But in this case, the value is not submit. We want to have it as go. If we save this and refresh the page, we now have a subscription form with an input field for the email and the go button. Pretty cool. As you can see, we have both on the same line. This is something that we're going to speak in more detail, why some elements, they break lines like P elements. As you can see, if we use P elements, we're going to have them in separate lines, and the same thing for the headings. But this doesn't happen with the input elements. This is because some elements are block elements, which will take the whole line, and some elements are inline elements, so they won't take a whole line for them. If you wanted to have the button on a separate line, let's remember what we just said. We could use the BR element between them. So doing this, we can see that now we have the submit button below it. But that's not what we want for now. All right, so if we wanted to add more fields to this form, let's say the radio buttons or check boxes, we could just use one of these examples here. Let's try to add maybe some radio buttons. Let's say this one. So as you can see, these are formed by inputs and labels, and then a line break, input, label, and line break. Let's bring two just as an example. So if we added them to our form, let's say at the top here, let's save this. If we refresh the page, so then we could have like an interest field. So the person could type if you're interested in HTML or CSS, and then you type your email address, and this could be our form. In this example, we don't have radio buttons. I just wanted to show you how to include them. We just have the email field. And for now, the ID and the name are not going to be important. We're going to use this when we're actually going to create the functionality to submit this form. So we use these attributes to differentiate the fields and also for other HTML elements, not just for forms. When we start using CSS, then we're going to add more IDs and classes. For now, it's fine like this. This one needs the value because that's how we define the text inside the button. And now another thing that we need to include here is the placeholder attribute. This is how we are going to add that text inside the field. So if we go to the original version, you see that before you start typing anything, there's this text that says your email address. So the way we do this is by adding a placeholder. We can add one with the text your email address. Let's save this. Going back to the page, now we have our subscribe section. We have the field for the email address, and we have the go button. Before we finish this lesson, we just have to do the login button. So remember that after that first list, we have this text and a button. So we can see that this text is actually smaller than the rest of the text of the page. So there is one HTML element that we can use for this without having to add any extra styles. And right after this list, I'm going to add the small element. This is going to bring a smaller text without us having to define the styles. So let's write login to view the project. And here we could use a form, but in this case, this is not exactly a form. In the other example, we had the email field, and then we had a button to submit the form. So it was part of that form, and therefore we used an input for that button. But this button is a bit different. It's not part of a form. It's probably just a link that's going to take you to the login page or open a login pop-up. So we're going to use a different element, which is the button element. The text that we want to be written inside the button is just going to be the content of the element, like all the elements we have on the body text of this blog post. So in this case, we have click to login. And let's save this and let's go back there to see what we have. So now we have login to view the project, and then we have the login button. Notice that we have them on the same line, and this is what I mentioned about block and inline elements. If we go back there, and instead of having a small element, if we had a P element, then they would be on separate lines. This is because the P element is a block element, but the small element is an inline element, and so is the button. So when we use two inline elements, they're going to be in the same line unless we add a line break. So let's go back there. Let's go back to the small element, and here we can add a line break. It's actually better to do this with CSS. I don't like using line breaks a lot. That should be used on very specific situations. Normally, what we would do is just setting either the button or the small element to be a block element. But this is something we are going to speak in the next lessons. For now, let's just add the line break. And going back there, now we have a small text and the button below, which is exactly what we wanted. So now we are done with the HTML structure, so it's time to start styling the page. And that's what we're going to start in the next video. Bye-bye. Hey, and welcome back. In this section, we're going to speak about CSS and styles. Now we're done with the basic HTML structure for this project. And now to make it look beautiful like the final version, we're going to need to start styling these elements. Before we do that, I need you to follow a link that I left right below this video. This is the link for the Figma prototype. This is where I did the web design before I started coding in HTML and CSS. So this is normally what happens on a website project. There will be the design first. So I designed all these elements with the sizes that I wanted and colors and all that. And then when I finished the design, I started writing the HTML and CSS to make it look like this. So if your intention is to work as a web developer, you're going to work a lot with prototypes like this. And just a few tips before we get started, just so you can use Figma without any problems. So the first thing is how to move inside the prototype. You can scroll down and scroll up, but I think it's easier to hold the space bar and then you can drag where you want to go, because like this, not only you can go up and down, but you can go left and right as well. If you want to zoom in, you can just use Ctrl+ or Ctrl- if you want to zoom in on some specific area, or you can also press Z and then you can just select the area where you want to zoom. And now we have this element, and the cool thing is that we can select them. So I'm just going to select this button. And if we go to the right hand panel, we can just click inspect. So here we have some of the properties we need to use for this element, and we should have everything we need in order to make our page look exactly like this. So how do we add these properties? We need to speak about styles. If you go to Google and search for CSS styles, you will see this article on W3 Schools where you can learn a lot about CSS styles. Again, I think this website is the best place for you to do your research on web development, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It's always going to be up to date, and I really like their simple explanation on any topic you can think of. So if you go down, you see that there are 3 types of styles. So we have the inline style, internal style, and external styles. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code so we understand how to use each of these. So starting with the inline style, this is the type that should almost never be used. First, this is going to bring a lot of repetition, because if I want to style, let's say, this paragraph, I'm going to have to add the styles to this one and to the other one and the other one. So I'm going to have to repeat everything. And not only that, but also we should avoid adding JavaScript or CSS to our HTML document. This has to be as clean as possible. So this is why it's always better to separate the styles at a different place. But I just wanted to show you this because in very specific situations, we might want to do this, but I have to tell you that this is going to happen rarely. So what we could do here, let's say we wanted to paint this age 1 in red, just as an example. We could add a property. Remember that with the image, we had a width property. We can also change any property by using the style attribute. So it's going to work the same way. We're going to add the equal sign, and then between quotation marks, we can set the styles we want. And now we're going to start adding CSS properties. The one used to change the font color is a property called color. So the way we write CSS is first we add the property and then a colon and then the value we want for that property. In this case, we're going to speak about colors in more detail, but in this case, I can just call them by their names. So I can add red, and that's it. I can save this, go back to the browser. If I refresh the page now, we can see that we changed the color of our age 1 by using inline style. Now, if we want to make the font bigger, so if we go back to the prototype, let's see the size of it. We'll see that here's the font. We're going to add the correct font later. We have the weight and we have the size. Let's try to change the size of it. So going back there, if we want to add more styles, we can just add a semicolon. And now we can add another pair of property value. So in this case, I'm just going to add a property called font size. So this was 48. So let's add 48 pixels. Let's save this. And now when we refresh the page, we have our font bigger. Pretty cool, but as I've said, we are almost never going to use the inline style. We should avoid adding styles mixed with HTML if we want to keep our structure clean. So I'm just gonna cut this with Ctrl X, just so we remove it from here. So now there's a second way of adding styles to element, and this is with internal style. The internal style is going to be listed inside the head of our HTML document. So here we have the head, and inside it, we are going to add a style element. Inside here, we are going to add the same properties, the same way we did there. So here, we are going to add the color, so property value, semicolon, property value. But there is something missing here, because now that we are not adding an attribute to a specific element, we need to tell the browser what element is going to get these styles. There are a few ways to identify elements. The most basic one is by its name. So in this case, this is for the age 1. So we can just write the name of the element. So in this case, it's age 1. Then we're going to open and close curly braces like this, and the properties are going to be listed inside. Just like that. So we have color red, semicolon, then another property, font size, which is set to 48 pixels, and we can add as many properties as we want. Let's save this. Let me just go down here to see if I erased everything. So yeah, the age 1 is clean. And now we have this style up here. Let's save this. Let's go back there and refresh the page. And now, as you can see, we were able to style this element. So now we are avoiding mixing CSS and HTML. But not only that, if we had another age 1 on the page, it would receive the same styles without us having to write it again. So let's do another example, this time with the H2, that we have more than one. So we can keep listing elements. In this case, let's go back to the prototype and let's see the H2s. So they are 24 pixels. So for the H2s, let's add a font size of 24 pixels. I'm also going to add just a random color just so we can see it better. We can remove this later. So for this one, I'm just gonna add a blue color. Let's save this, go back to the page, and now we are coloring all the H2s of our page. So we just list the element once, and it doesn't matter if we have it 50 times, all of them are going to be styled the same way, which is good. But still, this is not the best way of doing this. This is already much better than using inline styles. But still, this is the HTML document. We have some styles here, and this is gonna grow a lot. You will see that when we finalize the project, we're going to have close to 200 lines of CSS. So if we have all of this in the HTML page, this is gonna be a bit heavy. But not only that, if we work with templates and we have multiple pages sharing the same structure, we would have to add the styles to all the pages. However, if we have this in a separate file, we can use the same styles throughout the whole website. So the preferred way of adding styles to elements is with external styles. And this is going to be done with a CSS file. So let's click on this button to open the folder structure. We already added one for the images, and we're going to do the same thing for the CSS. So let's add a new folder. Let's call it CSS. And inside, we're going to create a new file called styles.css. Let's go back to the HTML file. Let me cut all this. We can also erase this style element. We're not going to need it anymore. Instead, we are going to paste the elements and the CSS properties on this file. So this is the syntax for CSS files. We are going to list elements, and inside curly braces, we are going to add property value pairs so we can style our elements. And now, how do we add a link to this file? Because if you go back to the HTML, there's nothing here that says that we need to get the styles from this file. So if we just save this now and refresh the page, you will see that the styles are not being applied. So the way we do this is inside the head element, and here we are going to add a link element. Visual Studio Code is suggesting a few options. Let's choose the CSS one. So as you can see, we have a link element with two attributes. One of the attributes is the type of this link, which is a style sheet. And the second one is the age ref. So just like anchor tags, the links we added, we are going to use the age ref to set the path of this CSS file. So the reference is going to be where the HTML file is, which is the root folder of our project. Inside this folder, we have another one called CSS. So let's start with CSS / and now our file is almost called the same way, but we have an S in the end, so styles.css. So we just added the link, and we are telling the browser that we should get all the styles from this file. Saving this and going back to the page. And now we can see the styles being applied, and all the styles of our page are placed on a separate file, which is going to make our HTML and CSS very clean. Alright, so now that we know a little bit more about styles and we use our first CSS properties, in the next videos, we're going to explore more properties and make our page look exactly like the prototype. I'll see you in the next video. Hey there, in this video, we are gonna continue styling our page. And we are going to get started with the header. So if we go to the final version, you can see that we actually have a background color. The text is white and centralized. So let's try to do that by adding styles to this element. So going back to the HTML, let's see how we can identify this element. So as you can see, we have the header element, which is what we used for this. There's nothing else here. So we can use this element to add the styles we want. So let's go to the CSS and let's add the header. Now we can remove the colors of the H1 and H2 because we were just testing these out. So normally the way I like organizing the properties is by section. So I'm going to actually remove these for now, because when we get to the body text of the article, we can get to these. For now, let's just start with the header section. So one thing that we have in our final version is a background color. For this, we are going to use the background color property. And as you can see, we have a few colors that we can use. But what we are actually going to do is using the X code. But we are going to leave this subject for the next video. So for now, let's just pick a dark color. It can be black or any other color you want from the list. If you go to Google and search for CSS Colors, let's go to W3 Schools, and then you can see a few names and X codes you can use. But this is the subject for the next video. So another thing that we need to do here is changing the color of the text to white. So color, white. And now we also want to centralize it. So we are going to use the text align property and we are going to set it to center. As you can see, these are all the options we have for the text align property. So we are going to set it to center. Let's save this. Let's go back there. And now we are starting to get somewhere. So we have white text, we have the background, and this is now centralized. But not sure if you notice, but we have some white space at the top and also at the sides. Same thing for the hero image. It should be touching the edge of the browser, just like we see in the final version. Everything should be 100% of the page. But in our example, this has some white spaces around. So this is where we're going to start using the inspector a lot. We need to try to identify what's going wrong here. So let's click with the right button and go to inspect, or use the F12 shortcut to open the inspector. Here we have the elements. So if we use this button to select an element, we can try to find what element has that space. It's a bit hard to find here. So instead of doing this, let's just try to hover over the elements we have. So here we have the header. We can see that there's nothing around it. But if we hover over the body, you will see that now we have that orange border. So this is telling us something. Let's click on the body, and right here you can see the default styles for the body. So one default property is the margin set to 8 pixels. So this is why we are seeing that space around the elements. We can't have the top bar or the hero touching the edges of the page. So let's do a test here. If we change the margin of the body to, let's try something higher, like 20 pixels. We can see that now the space is even bigger because we just changed it to 20 pixels. So what we want is just setting it to 0. If we set it to 0, now we don't have any space around these elements. So let's go back there. Remember that everything we do in the inspector is not going to be saved. So if I refresh the page, you can see that now the space is back. So here we are just testing stuff. And now that we know what we want to do, we can just go ahead and type it in our CSS file. So let's add the body. And let's set the margin to 0. So by doing this and refreshing the page, now we don't have that space anymore. So we just learned something about margins. Margin is the space outside of the element. Let's do a test with the header. Let's go to the header and let's try adding some margin. So let's say margin. Let's add something close to 20 pixels. And now we can see that we added margin on all sides. So above, to the right, bottom, and left. This is because we used the shorthand margin property. So with this property, we can just set one value and it's going to add it to all the sides of this element. But what if we wanted margin just below it? We could add a margin bottom property instead. So if we do this, let's save this, go back there and refresh the page. So now, as you can see, we don't have spaces at the top, and on the sides, we only have the margin below it. Let's increase that number so we can see it a bit better. Let's increase it to 100. Now, if we save this, we can see that now we have 100 pixels below it. So we can either use the shorthand property, which in this case is the margin one, and we can also add it just to one of the sides. Now let's continue here for a moment just so we can make some tests. I'm going to use this button to select the header, and when we hover over it, you can see that the margins are always highlighted in orange. That's what we were seeing in the body before, and now we are seeing the margin in this element. And if we select it, we can see that we set the margin bottom to 100. So this is what the margin is going to do, add space outside of this element or any element where you apply margins. But if we go back to the final version, you will see that we don't actually want any spaces outside of it. It's touching the edges of the window on top and sides, and right below it, we can see that it's touching the hero image. We have no spaces, so we don't need margins. However, inside it, we have some space. If we go back here, you will see that this is very thin, but if we go to the prototype and select this element, you can see that we have a height of 72. So there are two ways of doing this. We can either set the height of the element to 72, or you can just define some space inside it. So if we zoom in, let's just press Z and zoom in. I can select the text, and if I press Alt and then hover over the header, you will see that we have 23 pixels above the text and 24 pixels below the text. Actually, we shouldn't be seeing that difference. This is probably something that happened when I was touching and working with this element. So let's define 24 as a space we want below and above the text. So going back to our version, if we select the header, so instead of adding the margin, let's remove this margin. You can just uncheck this box. Now we don't have the margin anymore. We can add something different, which is the padding. So if you add a padding top instead, we can set it to 24 pixels. Now we added 24 pixels at the top, and let's add 24 pixels at the bottom as well. So 24 and 24, and this already started to look like the final version. But instead of doing this, we can actually use the shorthand property. So I'm going to unselect these, and just like we did with the margin, we can also declare just padding. In this case, we can just set it to 24. The problem here is that now let's hover over the element. You can see that we set 24 at the top and at the bottom, but also on the sides. And maybe we don't want that. Let's say we wanted to have an icon on the left or right side that had different paddings. So in this case, we're just doing this to increase the height of the header. We don't need to have the paddings on the side. So another way of using the shorthand property is adding 2 values instead of 1. So if we use either margin or padding and we set only one value, this value is going to be applied for all the sides. But if we use 2 values, so let's say 24 and 0, now it is going to apply 24 to top and bottom and 0 to left and right. And this is exactly what we want. Another way of using this, if you just want to use one line but you want to set different paddings for each of the sides, you can also add 4 values. So the first one is going to be the one for the top. So I can add 24 at the top, then 0 to the right, then I can add like 48 for the bottom, and 0 to the left. So this is another way of using the shorthand. So the first value is always going to be the one for the top, then right, bottom, and left. In our case, we don't want that. We just want to apply 24 for top and bottom and 0 for the sides. So this is what we're going to do with this header. Let's copy this. Now we can remove the margin bottom because we were just testing it. And now we are going to use the padding instead to add paddings to the top and bottom. Saving this. Refreshing the page. Now it's starting to look the way we want it to look. So just to recap, we use the margin property to add spaces outside of the element, and we can use the padding to add spaces inside it. So by doing this, we made sure that the text is also centralized vertically. So not only it is in the center horizontally, but also vertically. If we use the height instead, so let's remove the padding, and instead of doing this, let's set the height to 72 pixels. And now as you can see, the height is correct, but then we need more properties in order to center the text vertically. So this is why, for this case, it's easier to use the padding. So we are almost done with the header. Now we just need to set the right color. And in order to do that, I need to explain in more detail some concepts about colors in CSS. And this is the subject of the next video. I'll see you then. Hey there, welcome back. In this video, we're going to speak about CSS colors. So far, we've been using the color names. So we set the color of the text to white, and we set the background color of the header to black. Like I showed you in the previous video, if you go to W3 Schools, in the CSS Colors section, you'll see that we have 140 color names we can choose from. So let's try maybe the blue-violet one just to make a test. So instead of black, let's just add blue-violet. And as you can see, we can use that color. But of course, only 140 options of colors might not be enough, because if we actually combine red, blue, and green in different intensities, we can have much more options than just 140. And this is why we don't use the color names a lot. We normally going to use it for black and white, but for every other color, what we're going to use is either the X code or the RGB code. So let's go to Google. There's something cool we have here. If we type X color picker on Google, and as you can see, we have this interactive tool where we can choose any color we want, and Google's going to give us the X code and also the RGB code. So now we have many more options. Let's say we have something close to that violet. Let's go to the colors again. We just use this. So let's try this code here. If we copy the X code and we paste it here, now we have that exact same color for the blue-violet, but now we can maybe try different tones. We can maybe try it darker like this. And now we come up with this X code. If we copy this and we use it as a color instead of using the color name, as you can see, now we are able to choose the exact color that we want. So by using the code, we're going to have much more possibilities in terms of colors. And this is one way. And another way we can use colors is by using the RGB code. So instead of using the X code with the hashtag, we can just copy the RGB. So this is the number for red, green, and blue. We can just copy this. And instead of adding the X code, we can type RGB. And between parentheses, we paste that code. So this is the exact same color we had before, but instead of using the X code, we are using the RGB code. So which one is better? I personally think that the X code is easier to work with because we don't need parentheses and different numbers for red, green, and blue. We just have one single X code. I think this is more widely used. If you go to the prototype, you see that the default for the colors is actually the X code, but we could also choose RGB. And as you can see, this has an RGB code. This is actually a bit different, and this is where I think the RGB code starts to become interesting, because sometimes we might want to reduce the opacity of an element so we can see through it. So in that case, when I need transparency, I normally use the RGBA. So right here, instead of using RGB, we could use RGBA. And the last number is going to be the transparency or the opacity of the element. So 1 is the higher opacity, which means that we can't see through this element. But if we want to set like 0.5 opacity, we can see that now it looks lighter. And this is because it has low opacity. So what we are seeing here is actually the white background that we have behind it. So if we go to 0.1, you can see that this is even lighter. And when we need to do stuff like this, then we are going to need the RGBA code. In other situations, I just prefer to use the X code. So in this case, let's change it back to X. So this is the code we need for the background color of our header. So let's actually go back to Visual Studio Code. And instead of setting the background color to black, we are going to use the X code. As you can see, Visual Studio Code has this tool that you can hover over. If you want to choose a different color, you can change it right here. You can just hover over it and then just pick a different color like this. Press enter and it is going to change it for you. This is not what we want for now. So now this is right. Again, we could use the X color for white, which is FFF. So in this case, you can see that we can also use 3 characters instead of 6. If you want to learn more about how to form the X codes, you can just go to Google and type color X codes. But yeah, this is pretty much the same thing as using the 6 characters. So there are 2 ways of writing this when they are repeated. And we also have the X code for black, which is 000. So now we have plain black. But for black and white, I prefer to use the color name, which is easier. And for any other color, I tend to use the X code. Unless when I want transparency, then I'm going to use the RGBA. So that's basically it about the colors. Just another interesting thing I wanted to show you. So let me just save this and see how this looks. Let me refresh the page. So now we have the correct background color. Another thing that I wanted to show you, let's say you are on a website and you like a color and you want to have something similar to this. There are 2 ways of doing this. If you have an HTML element like this, the easiest thing will be to inspect the element. So you can just press F12 and then you can select the element you want. In this case, is this one. So as you can see, we have there the background, which is 04AA6D. So that's the color. Just ignore the important for now. We're going to speak about this later in the course. So if we wanted to use this color, we could just copy the X code, then just use it here. And now, as you can see, we just got the same color from that website. But sometimes they are on images, so it is a bit hard to get them. This happens a lot with logos. So if you want to find out what is the color of something that you can't inspect, you can do that with Photoshop, but it's also possible to do this from the browser. So if we go back here, let's maybe get the color we have on this image. We can't inspect this because this is an image. Let's actually put a bit, yeah, like this. If we try to inspect this, we will see that this is actually an image, so we can't get that color. However, if we select any HTML element on the inspector, let's say I choose this button, and then when I go to the property that it's setting the background color, if you click on this square, it's gonna open something that has a color picker. And this could be very useful because you can choose this, and now you are able to get not only colors of HTML elements, but for these, it's easier to just inspect them. But if you want to get colors inside images, it's going to work as well. So as you can see, let's try to get this blue. We can just click here, and now we can see that the X code is this one. So we can just copy this, and then we could use it on our element. So yeah, I just wanted to show that it's possible to do this. Let's just refresh the page. So now we are pretty much done with the header. We just need to adjust the font. As you can see, this one looks nicer because it has a different font, but the height is the same. The background color is correct. It's already touching the edges of the window. So in the next video, we're going to speak about fonts. I'll see you then. Hey there, welcome back. In this video, we're going to speak about CSS fonts. So in the previous video, we left our header almost done. Now the only thing we need to adjust here is the font family. If you see the final version, you will see that this text is way nicer. And let's check which font is being used, and then we'll speak about how to use CSS to change the font of texts. So going to the prototype, if we select this text, you will see that the font we have is actually Open Sans. So we can click this button to copy the whole thing about the text, but just be a bit careful when copying things from the prototype because not all the things that are here will be needed. But let's see for this example. So going back to Visual Studio Code, I could try to paste the whole thing here. For now, the text alignment is wrong. We don't need to set the letter spacing, neither the line height. For now, we will speak more about these things later in the course. For now, we just need the font family, font size, and the font weight. So if we save this and go back to the page, if we refresh the page, now we can see that the text is a bit bigger because we set the font size, but the font is still not the correct one. As you can see, this is still very different. And this because the font we chose, which is the Open Sans, it's not a font that the browsers have by default. So there are a few ways to use fonts with CSS, and the first way is picking a web-safe font. This is a group of fonts that most of the browsers have them by default. That's why they are called safe font. But Open Sans, it's not part of that group. So let's go to Google and search for CSS web safe fonts. We can go to W3 Schools as usual. So as you can see, we have some groups. So in this example, we have a few ones that are sans serif. We have the serif group. We have a monospace group and a cursive group. If you want to know more about each of these groups, you can research for them. I'm just going to show you one interesting thing about the difference between sans serif and serif fonts. So if we go to Google and search for sans serif versus serif, actually let's add fonts, and then we can go to image, and then we can see what's the difference between these two groups. So these little things that we find at the edges of the characters, these are called serif. So this font doesn't have these things, doesn't have the serifs. So this is why it's called sans serif. which means no serif. And these ones, they have the serif, so they are part of the serif group. All right, I just wanted to quickly show you this. So let's go back to the save font. So as you can see, the font we have on the prototype is not part of the web save fonts, which means that most likely the browsers won't have it by default. So if we want to use those fonts, we either need to get it from an online service like Google Fonts. We're going to do that in a moment, but we can also host our own fonts. I'm also going to show you this, how to do this, but for this project, the easiest thing is just using Google. But before we do that, let's just take a look at some of the save fonts. So as you can see, Arial is part of the save font. So if you want to use Arial, you can just select the text you want like this. Instead of Open Sans, I'm going to add Arial. And as you can see now, we were able to change the font because this is a save font. So my web browser has it by default. If I want to choose another one, let's say, let's go for the Verdana. We also have this font by default, so we can use it. But the problem here is that some browsers will behave differently. So if you want to make sure that if the browser doesn't have the font you're trying to use, at least it's gonna default by one of the same group, then you can add a second font family, which is going to be the fallback. So in this case, I'm trying Verdana, but if the browser doesn't have Verdana, then we're just gonna tell the browser to use any sans serif font. So if we do this, the browser will first try to find this one. If it doesn't have this one, it's going to use the default font it has for sans serif. And this is important because let's say you wanted to use one of the more different groups like the cursive one. Let's maybe try the brush script MT. If you try to use this font and the browser doesn't have it, you don't want it to default to serif or sans serif. You want it to default at least for something that looks like a cursive font. So that's why it's important to add the fallback. In this case, if we just want to use the default for the cursive group, we could add just cursive, and the browser is going to use its default. If you want to set a specific one first, then you can just copy the name. So first, the browser will try this. If not, just get any cursive font you have. And that's how we use web safe fonts. But of course, this doesn't give us many options in terms of design. We want to use nicer fonts. So a second way of working with fonts is by using an online service. And the most popular one for this, for sure, is Google Fonts. So you can just go to fonts.google.com. And here you have an almost infinite number of different fonts you can use. And you also have the instructions on the right side on how to use them. So let's say I wanted to use this Fascinate font on my website. So here are the instructions. We can just click on it. And then if you select the style right here, it's already selected. But if I remove, then I don't have any selected styles. If I select the style again, now I have all the instructions, and we just need to copy these links for the head of the HTML. So let's go to Visual Studio Code, go to the HTML first, and then before calling the CSS file, this is important. So when it's called, it already loaded the font. So first, we just copy those two links from Google, and then we call our CSS file. So then we can use this font family in the CSS. And now let's go back to the browser. And the second part of the instructions is actually what we need to use for the font family property. So we can just copy this. And first, let me save this. Now we can go to styles, and now I can just pick font family Fascinate, and the second value that we are adding here is actually the font group. So if it for some reason can't find the Fascinate font, it's just going to use any default cursive font. So we can save this, going back to the browser, refresh the page, and now we are using this super weird font from Google Fonts. Of course, this is not the font we need. So let's go to the prototype. If we select this text, you will see that this is actually called Open Sans, and this is a Google font. So going back here, we can also search for fonts. So let's go back to the home page. We can search for Open Sans. Here it is. Let's click on it. Here we can select a few styles. It's important that you only select the styles you are going to use, because otherwise there will be multiple requests, and this is going to decrease the performance of your website. This is just a very simple example, so that's fine. You don't have to worry too much about this. So for now, let's just add the regular one. So let's select this style. As you can see, the other one is still here. So first, let's remove the Fascinate. So let's remove all for the Fascinate. Now we only have the Open Sans. For now, we just want the regular 400. But if we want more styles later, let's say we want the medium, we're just going to select it as well. And now, as you can see, it's calling for specific font weights. So 400 and 500. For now, we don't need to do this. We can just import Open Sans. And then later, if we need more font weights, then we can just come here and update this link. So let's copy all this. Let's go back to the HTML file. And now we're going to replace the links that we had before. So now we have the links, the correct links for the Open Sans. They have been placed before. We call this the styles.css file, which is the correct way of doing this. Let me save this. And now we can just use font family Open Sans. If it doesn't find it for any reason, then we're just going to use the default sans serif. And that's the way to do it. Just copy this. And now going to the CSS, we can just change the font family. We don't need the font weight because, as you've seen, 400 is the regular one, is the default font weight. So when it's 400, we don't need to use it. If we want to use thinner or thicker fonts, then we can add the font weight, but for 400, we just don't need to include this property. So let's save this. And now if we go back to the page and refresh, we were now able to use the Open Sans, which is exactly the same font we have on the final version. Let's compare it. It still seems a bit different. I think I made a mistake and used a different font size. It's probably 16. So let's change it real quick. Normally, you would just follow the prototype. The prototype will have all the sizes you need to use. But in this case, since I had 16 on the final version, let's just change it to 16. Let's go back there, refresh the page. Now, if we compare this version with the final one, you can see that now it looks exactly the same. So we were able to import the font and use it in our page. Now there is another way of using fonts, which is self-hosting the font. I'm not going to go into this subject now. I think for simple projects like this one, using Google Fonts is probably the easiest way, and it's also very fast. It has very good performance, so there is no reason for you not to use this. But if in the future you need to work with self-hosted fonts, you can just search for CSS self-hosted fonts. This time I don't have the link to W3 Schools, but let's go to CSS Tricks, which is also a good website. So let's say you want a font that it's not on Google. It's a different font. There are websites that offer fonts. One example is dafont.com. So if you go to dafont.com, you will find some fonts that are very different from what you have on Google. So if you want to use one of these fonts, you would have to download all the files. And how would you use it in your website? So first, you would need to save the files that you download, so they can be WAF, WAF2, they can be TTF. There are some different file extensions that you can use, but basically you would have to save all these files in a folder, and then you would declare this font face where you would create something. So the same way we can use Open Sans or Arial, we can create one ourselves. So in this case, it's going to be my web font. And then you would need to define the source for the font. So you need to tell where it is by using the source and the URL and format. And then after doing this, you can use this as a font family for any element you want. But we are not going to go into that right now, because Open Sans is on Google and it's perfectly fine for our project. Just one thing that I wanted to show you before we finish this lesson is because right now we added Open Sans for the header, but all the other elements on the page, they have a different font. And if we go to the project, let's zoom this out a bit. If you select other elements, let's say the age one, you see that this is also Open Sans. It has a different weight, but it's still Open Sans. Same thing for the H2s and for the P elements. So if you want to set this font to all the HTML elements of your page, there's a shortcut to do this, which is using the asterisk. So going back to Visual Studio Code, instead of applying this font to the header, we could use the asterisk. So before the styles for the body, let's add the asterisk, which is going to include all the HTML elements on the page. So some things are easier to do it like this. So instead of defining the font family only for the header, we use the asterisk to select all the elements, and then we can set a font family to all of them at the same time. This way, we won't have to keep repeating these for all the elements. So if we save this now and go back to the page, let's refresh this, you will see that now we have Open Sans for the whole page, which is good. Now we only need to adjust the sizes and the weights, but part of the job is already done. Okay, pretty cool. So that was all I wanted to speak about fonts for now. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Hey there, we're just starting to style our page. We now have this top bar with the correct background color. We also imported the correct font. And now, in order to move ahead styling our page, we need to speak about something of extreme importance in CSS, which are the CSS selectors. We're going to use them to select more specific elements. So let's go to Google and let's search for CSS selectors. So here we have a few examples of how are we going to select elements from now on. So instead of just using the element's name like we did before, like this example where we select the P element, or here where you are selecting a div, now we're going to start using classes and IDs. So this is an example of a class. You can see that we use the dot, then the name of the class, and then we can add a style to that class. To understand what is this exactly, let's go to Visual Studio Code and make some tests. So let's say we wanted to apply some styles to this specific paragraphs. We can't use the name of the element because otherwise we are going to apply it to all the paragraphs in the page. So if we want to do something with this one specifically, we can add a class to it. So this is just going to be an attribute of the element. So we can add it in the opening tag. And then let's say we add a class of important. Now we can go to the CSS file, and the way we're going to apply styles to that specific class is by using the dot. So dot important, and the rest is exactly the same. Now let's select the font weight to bold. And if we go back there and refresh the page, we can see that now this whole paragraph has turned to bold, but not the other ones. And if we want to do the same with this one as well, we can just add the same class to it. So I can scroll down. I don't want it for this one, but I want it for this one as well. So we can copy the class like this. And let's add it to this paragraph as well. Save this. And now we are applying this style to specific elements on our page. HTML elements can also have multiple classes. So going back to Visual Studio Code, let's say for the first one, we wanted to have the class important, but we also want to create a class for a specific color. So let's name this class red, for example. And now this element has two classes, important and red. Now let's go back to the CSS file. Don't forget to save it first. And then here, let's add what we want for the red class. Now let's say we want this one. Now let's save this. And we changed it only for the first paragraph, which was the one we added the class red. Now we can get this class and we can add to any element we want on the page. Let's say we want to add to the age one as well. If we refresh the page, now we are using classes to create specific styles. Many modern CSS frameworks, they use this pattern of creating classes for specific styles, because then it's very easy for you to create a template and then you change the rules for many pages. Let's give one example. Now we have two elements with this class red. So let's say the designer wants a different tone of red. It's easy because we didn't add a color to each specific element. We created one class that is shared by multiple elements. So if we want to change this, it's fine. We can just change it in the class like this. Let's save this. And if we get back there, then all of them will be changed. All right, so let me erase this because these were just examples. Same thing here for the classes I added. So I'm just going to hit Ctrl Z to remove all the classes. Another thing we can use are IDs. IDs are for unique elements. So let's say we have this age one here, and we want to add a unique ID to this element. So let's add the ID of post title, for example. And the way this is going to work is similar to the classes, but the difference is that, like I said, the ID is unique, which means that we can't use this ID for other elements. And also, we can't add more than one ID. An element can only have one ID, and this ID cannot be shared with other HTML elements on the page. So in this example, now we added the ID to this element. Let's go to the CSS file, and instead of using the dot like we do for classes, we're going to use the hashtag. So we can say, for example, that we want the font size of 100 pixels. And if we go back to the page and refresh, you can see that now we have changed the size of the title. So this is how we use IDs, and elements can also have one ID and then multiple classes. So I can add the class attribute. Let's use the same example. And then I could add the red class and change the color this way. So just to recap, so far we've learned 3 ways of selecting HTML elements. We started with the elements' names, and in this video, we learned how to use classes and IDs to select HTML elements. Now, if we want to be even more specific and select elements that have specific relationships or maybe select multiple elements at the same time, we're going to need to use some patterns. That's the subject of the next video. I'll see you then. Hi there, in the previous video, we learned how to use classes and IDs to select HTML elements, and now we're going to learn some patterns to be even more specific. So if we go back to the article where we saw about classes and IDs, we can see that we have a few more examples below. So first, we start with a simple example where we create a class called intro, and then we can select these elements. But now we start having some patterns like one class followed by another class. In this first example, we don't have a space. In the second example, there is a space. So we need to speak about these patterns. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Now let me erase this ID first. Let's go back to that important class. And we are also going to add another class called level 1. Now, instead of applying this to the h1, let me just cut this. And I'm going to use this for the paragraphs. So this one, for example. And now I'm going to do the same thing for the next paragraph, but this one is going to be level 2. So this one has 2 classes, this one has 2 classes. Let's save this and go into the CSS file. If we set any styles to the important class like this, then of course, both of them will have that style. So as we can see, the first paragraph, the second one, both of them have the bold style. But if we want to apply this only for the one that has class of level 1, we can add more classes. So if you don't add the space, it means that the element must have all of the classes that we list. For example, we could add dot important and then without the space, dot level 1. This means that we want an element that has these 2 classes. Let's save this. If we refresh the page now, we can see that only the first one was styled. And this is because this element has the 2 classes that we selected. And how about the same thing but with a space? This is a bit different. This means that we want a level 1 element that is inside an important element. So if we leave it like this, let's save and let's go back there. Now we don't have any element styled. This is because we don't have any level 1 element inside an important element. But if we go back to the HTML and instead of adding level 1 to the P itself, let's add it to this A element that is inside the P element. So now we have a level 1 element inside an important element, which is exactly what we are trying to select here. So with the space, we're trying to select the element with this class that is inside an element with this class. Without the space, we want an element that has both classes, so it's important to know the difference. So now let's add the space. Let's go back to the page and refresh. And now, as you can see, we have the bold style in that A element. Now, another interesting thing we can do here, let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And we know that all these elements are inside the main section. We can also use elements names with classes and IDs, all of them together. It's no problem at all. So something we can do here, let's go to the styles again. So let's do this. Let's use the main element. And now we're trying to select any level 1 element that is inside a main element. Let's save this. Let's go back there. And as you can see, we still have the bold style here. This is because even though we have a few elements in between, but this element is actually inside the main element. But if we only want to apply to direct children, then we can use the greater than symbol. So we could do this. And now we only want level 1 elements that are direct children of the main element. Let's save this, and here we have a direct child. Let's add a class of level 1. If we go back there, probably this one is not good because it's already bolded. So let's also add a color so we can see this better. And now we can see that it has only been applied to this element. This is because we are not selecting any level 1 element inside the main. We are only selecting the ones that are direct children. Since we have some levels here, so here we have a P and then an A, we can't apply the styles to this element, only to the one that is a direct child of the main element. So this is how we use the greater than symbol. Another thing we can do is selecting all elements. Let's say we want all elements of the page to be like this. We can just use the asterisk. And now we are applying this to all elements on the page. So now all the elements on the page are bold and green except for this one. So later we are also going to speak about precedence so we understand why this style has been applied and not the green one, but that's not for this video. So going back to Visual Studio Code, another thing we can do is selecting all elements that are inside the main element. So here we are only going to select elements that are inside the main, but all of them. Let's test this out. Let's see what happens. So if we refresh the page, we can see that the elements that are outside the main element, which are these ones in the footer, they did not get those styles, only the ones inside the main element. We can also add styles to multiple classes or elements at the same time. So going back to Visual Studio Code, let's say we want to add this to all P elements, but we also want to apply for the H3s, for example. We can use the comma, so P, comma, H3. If we save this and go back there, we can see that now we are applying this to all P's and also for the H3s. You can also use classes here, so all the elements that have the class of important as well. So this way we apply these styles to all these elements. Now let's say right down below, I add another block here, but just for the P's. This is something that could easily happen on larger CSS files with more lines, because sometimes you add a style at some point in your CSS file and then many lines below, you end up adding it again. This could happen. We need to try to avoid it. We need to be as organized as possible with how we use the selectors in our CSS file, but sometimes it can happen. So in this situation, do you think that the paragraph is going to be green or blue? Let's save this and let's see. So as you can see in this example, the second one has been applied. In order to understand this, we need to speak about CSS precedence. And this is the subject of the next video. I'll see you then. Hey there, in this video, we're going to speak about CSS precedence to understand why the blue has been applied to the P and not the green. Before we do that, let me just erase this important class because we're going to have something else called important and I don't want to confuse you with that. This one was just a class I created. So I'm going to delete it from here and also remove it from the HTML file. Now let's go to Google and let's search for CSS precedence. You can choose any article. Let me just choose this first one that appeared here. So there are still a few rules we need to speak about specificity, but the basic precedence rules are these ones. So this is why I said I was going to erase that important class, because I didn't want to confuse things. You can choose any names you want for your classes, but what we are seeing here is different. This is an instruction that we pass when we declare a property. I'm going to show how this works in a minute, but we can see that this is the most important rule, which means that in the example that we had, so we can go back there, and now we have two styles for the P element. We saw that this one took precedence, but right here, if we add that exclamation mark important, this is going to override all the others. No matter how we write them, this one is always going to be the one applied. So now if we go back to the page and refresh, we can see that the green has been applied. So let's remove this just so we can see. Without the important, the blue has been applied. So let's understand why. So the second rule is going to be the specificity of the CSS rule selector. So this is what we're going to speak about in a minute, but basically this is about being more or less specific. So in this example here, if we defined a specific class for the P, like we want the P's, but only the ones that have a specific class. Let's call this class green. In our HTML, if we add the green class to any of the P's, let's see what happens. We can see that the other ones are blue, but this one got the green color. And why is that? This is because this one was more specific than this one. So this was only selecting all P elements, but this one is more specific. I want P elements with a class of green. So this is why, on this case, this one took precedence. And now the third rule is just the sequence of the declaration. This is why in the previous example we had, where we just declared the P 2 times, we can either test another thing like actually copying this one and creating a new block for the P. Let's use pink. If we go back there, we can see that now the pink took precedence, and this is because of the order of the declaration. They have the same specificity, neither of them have the important instruction, so the rule here is the order. The last one is always going to be applied because the CSS file is read line by line, so the last one to be read by the browser will be this one, so this is why this one is the one applied. If you want to know more about specificity, I'm not gonna go into too much details about this right now because I don't want to confuse you with that. That can be a bit overwhelming, but if you want to, you can search for CSS specificity. Let's maybe go to W3 schools, and here you're going to have many examples that will tell you the hierarchy. For example, it's telling here that the inline styles will take precedence over IDs, which will take precedence over classes, and then elements and pseudo-elements. So like I said, I'm not going to go into this right now. So let's go back there. Let's remove these things that we use for testing. I'm also going to hit Ctrl-Z all the way to the end on the HTML file so we have it clean. I'm going to remove all classes and IDs that we added in the previous 3 videos. Let me refresh the page. So now it is as it was before. Okay, so now we are ready to move forward. Now that we learned how to select HTML elements and how to set styles for them, we're ready to do the styles for the rest of our project. So I'll see you in the next video so we can continue. Hey there, in this video we're going to do a small adjustment to the hero image. But why do we need to do that? Isn't it good already? Let's remember something here. I'm just going to right click and go to Inspect. Now let me select the image with this button. So here we have the image. So remember that we added this with attribute. And when we did that, I said this wasn't ideal. This is because we should be keeping all our styles in the CSS file rather than in line with the elements like this. So going back to Visual Studio Code, here's the image. Let's remove that and let's use CSS instead. So let's go to the styles and then we can just add a style for image elements. And then the name of the property is width and we can set it to 100%. If we do this and refresh the page, now we have the same result, but we don't have that inline style anymore. That wasn't actually a style. There is also an attribute called width, but it's pretty much the same thing. Every property we use to set dimensions of images, colors, fonts, everything related to styles should be in the CSS file. So this is good. However, there's one problem with what we just did. So let's get an example image here of a person, for example. Let's just search for person image just so we can use one as an example here. We can get any photo here. Let's use this guy. Let's use Bill Gates. I'm just going to right click on Bill Gates and choose copy image address. And now we can go back to our HTML file and further down the text here of the blog post, I'm going to add that image. So here we can use a source inside our project like we had for the hero section, or we can use a link from the internet. In this case, I can just paste the path of the image I just copied from Google. Let's add an alt text. Bill Gates. Let's save this. Let's go back there and see what happened. So now, as you can see, the Bill Gates image is now taking 100% of the page, which of course it wasn't what we wanted. It's very stretched. That's why we're seeing this blurry. And this is because we selected all the images. If we go back to the CSS file, you can see that we selected all image elements. And this is not right. So how can we solve this? Well, there are a few ways of solving this. It depends on your preference. You could add maybe a class to that image. So let's say we only wanted that style for this image. So we could add a class like hero image. And now how can we select only that image? Let's remember that if you want an image that has a specific class, you need to put that class name here without spaces. So we want every image that has a class of hero image. Now refreshing the page, we can see that Bill Gates' photo is now fine and this one is taking 100%. So this is one way of solving this. Or you can also do something like this. We want to select the images, but we only want to select images that are inside a specific element. So in this case, we can see that we have this section here. And what we could do is add a class to this. So let's add the class of hero image to the section instead. So we have an element with a class of hero image with an image inside. How can we translate this into CSS? First, we need to declare this class name. So hero image. And since we want every image inside this element, we can just use a space. And now we are selecting all image elements that are inside an element with this class. If we save this and go back to the page, we can see that this is taking 100% of the screen, which is what we want, but not the other photo. Now, is it better what we just did, or is it better to add a class to the image? I think it's better to use this second option, because if we need to do more specific things to this section, we can do this the same way. So we can use the hero image class and then we can modify other elements inside it. So I think this is good. Let me remove that image of Bill Gates. And now we are ready to move on with the rest of the page. For that, we need to speak about something very important in CSS, which is the display property, and that's the subject of the next video. I'll see you then. Hey there, in this video, we're gonna start styling the content of the page after the hero section. And the first thing we can notice if we go to the final version is that we have something that is very common in web design and web development, which is a page container. So as you can see, some elements take 100% of the page, like the header and the hero image, but some elements, they are inside a container in the middle of the page. And this is the case for the article, and this is also the case for this part of the footer. We can see that they all have the same alignment because they are inside the same page container. If you go to other websites, you will see this pattern in pretty much all of them. So let's go, for example, to Microsoft.com. And you can see that there's this logo aligned to the left. Let's keep the cursor here and start scrolling down. You will see that the elements below, they are following that alignment. And this is their page container. You can see that the element below is also inside this container. So here is the end of this container. Same thing for this next element. But when we get to the footer, this is a bit different. We have a background that it's taking 100% of the screen, but the menus inside this footer are also inside the page container. So as you can see, this is something very common in web development, but this is something very simple to do. We just need to have a page container. Before we create one, there is one important concept that we need to understand, and this is the display property. So let's do a few tests here. Let me open Visual Studio Code. And now right before the H2, let's create a few examples. So I'm going to create two divs with a class of green. And one interesting thing here, I think I didn't mention this yet, but there are some shortcuts so you can create elements faster in Visual Studio Code. So if you want a div with a class of green, for example, you don't have to create the div and then add the attribute. You can just type it like this, div.green. Then when you press enter, it is going to magically create this div for you with a class of green. You can do the same thing for IDs, like div with an ID of test. As you can see, this is a nice shortcut. You can even create multiple divs. So I could create one with the class of green. And if I want more, like 3, I can just use the asterisk and multiply it by 3. And as you can see, we just created 3 divs with a class of green. This is something that can increase your productivity a lot. So let's do it like this. Let's go to the CSS file and let's add a style to these green elements. Let's add a border to them. So border. Let's use a border with 1 pixel. A solid border with the green color. Actually, it's not OX, it's PX. We're gonna speak more about borders later. Let me save this, and now we have 3 elements. Let's put some numbers on them so we can see on the page. Now we have 3 divs with a class of green with numbers 1, 2, and 3. Let's do the same thing, but this time let's use the span element. So span with the class of green, and I want 3 of them. All right, let's save this and let's go back to our page to see what happened. And now we can see the borders, and you can see that these elements, they look very different. Even though we only set one property for them, which was the border, we can see that the first 3 ones are taking the whole line, and the second ones are taking just enough space to fit the content. This is because of the default display property. So some elements by default, they are block elements, like the divs, the paragraphs, the headings. These elements by default, they are block elements, which means that they are going to take the whole line. It doesn't matter if you only have one character inside, they're going to take the whole line. And if you create another element after that, it is going to start on the next line. But with inline elements like images or links or the spans that we use here, by default, they are inline elements. So they're just going to take enough space to fit the content, and they can be positioned on the same line. This is why this happened. So if we wanted to change this, we could change the spans to have the block behavior. So going back to Visual Studio Code, we can come here and say that all the spans in our page, they are going to be block elements. So we can set the display to block. If we do this and go back there and refresh the page, now we can see that they are behaving just like the divs. They are now block elements. Of course, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that because it's very useful to have elements that we can use side by side, like images. We could have maybe a carousel of images where they show side by side. And it's also useful to have elements that will take the whole line. So why is this important, and what does it have to do with the page container? Well, let's go back to the HTML. Let's remove the spans for now. We don't want to use them just now. Let's just use the divs. We know that they take the whole line. So we have this class of green, which is fine. Now let's say that instead of them taking the whole page like we had, so here we can see that they take the whole page. Let's say we only want them to be this size. So let's just inspect this to see what's the size of it. Let's maybe go to the paragraph. We can see that it's 800 pixels and 47. So instead of letting it take the default width for block elements, which is 100%, let's set a specific width for them. So 847 pixels, just like the examples we had. And now if we go back and refresh the page, we can see that now they're not taking the whole line, but only 847. And this is exactly what we need to create page containers like this, but we don't want them to be touching the left edge. We want them to be centralized. And this is very simple to do. We can just set the margins for auto. So if we use just margin, let's remember that we can have margin left, margin right, margin top, margin bottom. But if we just use margin, this is going to be applied for all the four sides. And we are just going to set this to auto. If we do this and refresh the page, now you can see that we successfully created 3 div elements, which are block elements. They are taking the whole line, but they are not covering 100% of the page. They're just getting 800 pixels and 47, which is really cool. However, just be a bit careful with this, because if you reduce the page size like this, for example, let's see how this would look on tablet or mobile devices, you can see that now the page is bigger, and this shouldn't be happening. This 847 shouldn't be the width of the elements. So instead of setting a fixed width, we can say that you can take the whole screen, that's fine, but the maximum width that I want for you is 847. So instead of using width, we could use max width. Let's refresh the page. So now we can see that they are taking 100% of the screen by default, as block elements do. But if we keep increasing the page, you will see that when they get to 847, they're not going to grow more, because that's the maximum width that we want for them. Pretty cool. So this is how we are going to create page containers. There will be a few challenges because if you go to the complete version, you will see that the footer is one example. We have the container for the content, but the background is taking 100% of the screen. But this is something very, very simple to manage. And this is what we're going to do in the next video. Bye-bye. Hey there, in this video, we're going to create our page container. Now that we learned a little bit more about the display property and the difference between block and inline elements, we can now create our page containers. So if we go to the final version, you can see that some of the sections here of our page, they are inside a page container. And that's the case for the content of the article and also for this part of the footer. So in order to create a page container, we can set a specific class. So instead of using this green class, let's create a class called page container. You will see this a lot in web development projects. They are either like this or just called container. That's very, very common. Here, let's keep the border for now, just so we can see it better where we are going to apply this. So now we have a specific class for the page container. We can save this. Let's go back to the HTML. We don't need these divs anymore. That's fine. Let's save this. And now let's go back to the final version to see where we need the page containers. For this element, we don't need it. We just have a centralized text. Same thing for the hero image. And the whole content of the blog post is inside the container. So let's see where the hero image is. This one, then we have the main. Let's close the main. So the whole content of the post is inside main. So we could add a div around the main with a class of page container. But since everything inside the main will be inside the container, we can just set this class to the main element. So if we set the class to the main element, it is going to have that max width. It is going to have the auto margin, which means it is going to be positioned in the center. Let's save this. If we go back to the page and refresh, now we can see that we were able to place all the content of the article inside that page container. So we're going to remove the border in a moment, but this is useful to just leave borders or background colors so you can see exactly where elements start and where they end. I really like doing this, so let's leave the border for now. So we have done this successfully with the content of the post, but this is going to be a bit more tricky, and let's see why. Let's try to do the same thing for the footer. So we have this class on the main. Let's copy this. Let's go for the footer. And let's include the page container in the footer as well. So let's save this. Let's refresh the page. And now you can see that the footer is also aligned. But we need to apply the background to the footer. So let's inspect this to see the color. Let me just select the footer. Where's the background color? Here it is, background color for the footer. Let's go back to the CSS file and set it now. So eventually we're going to need this background color for the footer. Let's save this. Let's go back there. If we refresh the page, now we have a problem because we want the content to be inside a container, but we don't want the whole element because otherwise we can't have that background that goes 100% of the screen. If you see the example, this is what is happening here. The background color is applied to 100% of the screen and only the content is inside a page container. But that's very simple to do. You can always leave stuff at 100%, and when you need the page container, you can add it multiple times. Remember, we can use classes in multiple elements. So instead of adding the class to the footer, let's remove it from the footer. And here we can just create a section or a div. Let's do that. Let's create a section with a class of page container, which is inside the footer. Let me just cut the ending tag. So all of these elements, we want them to be inside the container. Not the last one, because the last one is also going to need 100% to have that blue background. So let me end this element here. Be careful with the indentation. This is the correct alignment. And let me just press tab to align everything inside. Now we can clearly see what's inside this section. So we have a section with a class of page container. If we save this now and go back there, we can see that now we just solved our problem. We have the footer area with that gray background that it's taking 100% of the screen, but the content is inside the page container because we added another section and added the page container class. So this is how you work with page containers. Let's go back to the CSS. This is looking all good, but we don't need the borders anymore because now we know what's going on here. Let's save this. Let's refresh the page. So we successfully created the page container. This is starting to look much more like the final version. So in the next video, we're going to continue styling this page. I'll see you then. Bye-bye. Hey everyone, in the previous video we learned how to work with page containers, so now we have the main content of our website aligned correctly in the middle of the page with some white spaces on the sides. Now let's do some fine adjustments, because if we go to the final version, you see that here we have different margins, font sizes and all that. So let's make everything as per the design. Let's go to Figma. Remember, we have the prototype on Figma. If you don't have the link for this, I'm pasting again right below this video. So here we can just click on the elements and we can see all the CSS. So let's adjust the font sizes first. If I click on the H1, let me go to Inspect here on the right hand side. And here we have the CSS. So we can see the properties first, and then if we scroll down, we have the CSS code if we think it's easier to copy. Let's remember that the prototype is only to give us an idea of things. It's not to just come here and copy everything and then paste there, because this is not going to work. Some of the things we're not going to set, like if you look at this left property, it's set at 328. This has nothing to do with the way we do things on the HTML, so let's just be a bit careful here. Same thing for position, absolute. There's nothing to do with this. So let's just go to the font properties. We don't have to set the font family because we already did that for the whole document. We don't have to set font style, but we need to set font weight. So this is going to determine if this needs to be bold or semi-bold. We also need the font size and the line height. So let's copy these three. Actually, we want the color as well, but let's make some change here in a moment. So just copying all these things and going back to Visual Studio Code. So here we have the H1 inside the main. Since we know that we should only have one H1 per page, unfortunately, sometimes you are working with projects that already existed before you started working on them. So you might have pages with more than one H1. So it's a good practice to make this more specific. So instead of just adding H1, let's only add the style to the H1 that's inside a main. So here we're going to add the main element and then the H1. So now we are only applying for H1s inside the main. If you have more than one H1 inside main and you want them to have different styles, you can try to be more specific about the parents of this element, or you can just add different classes to each of the H1s. So here, let's paste this. We can just erase this comment. So now we have font weight of 600, font size, line height. Let's speak about line height in more detail in a moment. Let's just see how this looks. So I'm going to save this. Refresh the page. Now this is starting to look much more like our prototype. Now one thing we need to adjust here, if we go back to the prototype and we select the title, so we got the styles from here, including this 111X code for the color. Now if you go to the rest of the document, normally when the designer makes the decision to use a different dark color like this. So this would be replacing black. So if I change this to 000, which is the actual code for black, then you see that we can barely notice any difference, but the color we had before is a bit lighter. So let me just zoom in to the age 1, and now let's try changing it back to 111. So as you can see, it's a very small difference, but this is a decision of the designer. And normally when this happens, if you select the other elements, you will see that he's using the same code for all the dark texts of our document. So instead of applying this just to the age 1, we can apply this to all the texts in our document. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. So instead of placing this here, let's do it in the same place that we added the font. So we added the font to all the elements in the page. And now we can also add this dark color. Of course, this is not going to be very good because some of the texts are not this color, but that's fine because when that's the case, we are going to add it like we did for the header. Here we are being more specific. So remember the hierarchy of the properties that are going to be considered by the browser. So in this case, we have this that's not very specific. It's just pointing to all elements. So by using the element, we are being more specific. And also, if we have the same level of specificity, this one appears further down the code. So this is the one that will be considered. So we can save this, and when we go back there, let's just confirm that this is working. Now we can see that the other elements on the page didn't change, so this remains white. But if we inspect this element here, so let's do that now. Now let's select it. We can see that now we changed its color to 111. And if we select the other ones, like the P element, we can see that the color has been applied to it as well. So we don't have to do that to all elements. And this is a good practice because if this changes, and in a real life project, this is going to happen a lot. The designer is still going to be tweaking things when he sends you the prototype for you to start working on. So maybe this is going to be changed later. Let's see something similar. So maybe the designer wants to change this to 242424. And now instead of having to go to all the elements to do this, we could just change that one property that we just added to all elements. So that's it. Now let's quickly speak about line height. If you select, for example, the P element, let's try changing its line height, just so you can see what this is doing exactly. So if I use 100 pixels, this is a bit too exaggerated, but as you can see, what I'm doing is changing the heights of each of the lines. So we have one line here, which has this height of 100 pixels. And then we have the second line and the third line. Of course, no one's gonna use such big line heights. I just wanted to show you. Normally, what you want to use is something like 6 or 8 pixels higher than the font size. So if we hover over this element, we can see that the font is 16 pixels, which means that something around 22 or 24 of line height is going to look good. So if we try that, 24, we can see that this looks good. Now this again is a decision of the designer. If the designer wants a bit more, like 26, I see some websites that have a bit of a higher line height like this. So this is why we are using this property. If we go here and then just select the age one, let's go to inspect, we can see that the line height is 58, which is 10 pixels higher than the font size. So this is normal for titles. Sometimes for titles, we just use 10 pixels greater or something like this, but let's see how it is for the P element. So for the P, we have 16 and 22, which matches exactly that 6 to 8 pixels that I mentioned earlier. Again, this is not something that the developer needs to worry too much about because you are going to receive this from the designer. Okay, so now let's copy the styles for the P elements as well. So we only need font weight, font size, and line height. remember that we applied the color to all elements of the page. So let's copy this. Now going back to Visual Studio Code, let's do the same thing we did above, but instead, this is going to be the P element. So going back there to check, now we have the correct font size and line height and color for the H1 and for the P. We can just compare to the final version. Let's just close the inspector so we can see it better. Now we just need to adjust a few things like margins. So this is what we're going to start doing in the next video. I'll see you then. Hey there, in this video we're going to speak about margins and paddings as well as some best practices when working with them. So if we look at the margin that we have above the H1 and compare this to the final version, by eye this looks to be more or less the same, but we can't trust our eyes for this. We always need to go to the design and confirm. So if we click on this element, and we hold the Alt key here on Figma, and then we hover over the element above, we will see that we have a 60 pixels margin. So this is what we need to use on our page. But we need to be a bit careful here, because if we add this to the H1, and this is what I was speaking about best practices in the beginning, because if we add 60 pixels to the H1 element as a margin top, we could just come here and do it like this. So margin top 60. But the problem of doing this is that if you go back to the prototype and you go all the way to the end of this main element, let's see the space between this button and the end of the element. This is also 60 pixels. So this is something that if the designer decides to change this to 80 or 100, probably they're going to want to change both at the top and at the bottom. That's why I don't like to leave this initial space of an element as a margin top of the first element. I don't think that's very consistent. I think this just confuses things. So we need to try to keep a clean code since the beginning. So instead of adding the margin top to the H1, let's just add paddings that we know that are spaces inside element. So it's going to have a space inside it of 60 pixels, and we can do this to the top and bottom of the element on the same line of CSS. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Here we have our main element. It's also important that while writing the code, we keep everything related to the main here together instead of adding in the middle of the other properties. This is going to make it easier to find stuff. So here for the main, we can just add the paddings, and we can use this shorthand property so we can define 60 for top and bottom. If we just leave it like this, we know that this is going to apply 60 pixels for top, bottom, left, and right. This is not what we want. So if we add two values instead, and here when we use 0, we don't need the pixels. We can just type 0, but that's just for 0. If it was like 5 pixels, we couldn't do it like this, okay? It's just for the 0 that you can omit the pixels. So doing this, we're going to apply 60 top and bottom, 0 to the sides. Let's save this. And now let's just inspect this. As you can see, we have 60 pixels above, but the problem is that the H1 still has the default margin. So what we need to do is just going back there, and we want to remove the default margin, or we want to set the correct margins according to the prototype. So if we go to the prototype, we won't need anything above it because we are already setting a padding to the main element, and below it we can see we have 13, and this is something that I would confirm with the designer. I don't like using odd numbers for spacings, so I would just use 14 pixels. So going back to Visual Studio Code, we can also use a shorthand property for the H1. So we are going to set margin, and then we can just set, and now this is going to be a bit different because we only want to set margins for top and bottom, but they have to be different. So we are actually going to have to type all of the corners of the element. So we know that when we do this, we just need to enter 4 values. And by doing that, the first one is going to be the top one. So we want 0 for the top. We want 0 for the right side. And for below, we need 14 pixels. And then 0 to the left side as well. All right, so saving this and going back there. Now let's inspect these elements. We can see that for the main, we have 60 pixels of padding, and this is represented in green. And if we select the age one, we can see that now we don't have any margins at the top, and we have the correct 14 pixel margin to the bottom. Okay, so now let's adjust our H2s and see if we need to do anything else for the piece. Going back to the prototypes, let's select the H2, these titles in the middle of the text. So we can see the font weight, font size, and line height. Let's copy all that. And going back to Visual Studio Code, we need to open one for the H2s as well. Now let's see what the margin is. So hovering over, first selecting the H2 and then hovering over the P below it and pressing Alt, we can see we have 14 pixels as well and nothing at the top, probably because we're going to have the default margin for the paragraphs. Let's get to that in a moment. So here we are also going to add the same thing, 14 pixels below them. Now going to the paragraphs, this is sometimes a bit trickier because as you can see, we have both paragraphs here and there's no clear indication of what the margin is. So for the paragraphs, unless the designer says something specific, we can just leave the defaults. So let's go back to the page to see what are the defaults. Okay, so now we have for the H2, we can see the 14 pixel margin. And the default for the P would be 16 pixels. Again, if we have no clear indication from the designer, we can just leave the defaults for the P element. And the cool thing here is that you can see that between the P's and between the H1, H2, and so on elements, we can see that the margins, they overlap. So we don't have to worry that they're going to be duplicated. We can see we have this one set at 14, we have this one set at 16, and they're not duplicated. So this is looking fine. The only thing that I can see here is that we don't have enough space between this part and the introducing HTML. So if we go to the prototype, we can see that we are also missing these images. We're gonna fix that in a moment. But first, let's see the space we have between these elements. So here we can see 39. Again, I don't like using odd numbers, so I'm just going to use 40. So going back to the HTML, and we have this div that doesn't have any class. So here is a bit difficult to refer to it in the CSS. So let's add a new class, which is going to be post author. Let's save this. And now before the H1s, because this element is above it in the HTML structure, let's add one below the main element. Don't forget to use the dot before it because it's a class. And now we want to apply a margin bottom of 40 pixels to this element. Pretty cool. Going back there, let's refresh the page and now we have the correct margins. If we go down here, maybe we still need to adjust some things below it, but let's focus on the main element first. And now that this is done, we are ready to add the social media icons. I'll see you in the next video, so we start with that. Hey everyone, in this video, we are going to add these two social media icons to our page. So if we go to the projects folder, you will see that we have not only the image for the hero, but we also have the icons for this section. So then it's easier. We don't have to download any assets. We can just go to our HTML and add them to the code. So let's do that now. So going to the HTML, we can add it inside the post author because in the end, that's probably the links to the author's profile. We just need to be a bit careful here, and we're going to see why in a moment. So let's add these elements. Let's remember that if you want to add 2 elements on Visual Studio Code, 2 image elements, you can just use the shortcut img and then asterisk 2. And this is going to add 2 images, 2 image tags. For the first one, this is just going to be inside images, and then we just want whatever. Let's see what's the first one here. It's the LinkedIn one. So that's the name of the file. Again, either use the recommendation from Visual Studio Code or just go and copy the file name so you don't make any typos here. So the out could be LinkedIn icon. And here this is going to be similar, but instead we're going to use the Facebook icon. Let's save this. Let's see what happens. And now we can see the images fine, but the problem is that the images are on the same line. Let's remember that images are inline elements and therefore they are not gonna break lines automatically. So we have a few ways of doing this. We could either add a BR element like this. So this is used to force a line break. So if we do that and save it, we can see that now we did what we want. But I don't like doing this because now if we want to set a margin for both these elements, we can't do it very well with the line break. And it's also not a very good practice to insert these line breaks. So the best way of doing this, instead of using the BR, it would be just to create a div, because divs by default, they are block elements. So if we add these images inside it, let's save this. Now, since the div is a block element, we can see that they are now on a separate line, which is good because now we can add a specific margin to this element. So let's add a class for this, social links. Now let's go back to the prototype to see the margin of this. So we have 12 pixels. So going back to the styles, let me just copy this. This is inside the post author. So with this, we can be very specific here. So everything inside the main, inside post author, inside social links, because that's exactly what we have there. We can just add a margin. Let's remember what it was. So it was 12. So margin top, 12 pixels. Now let's see if this is working. Okay, this is starting to look better, but there's still something missing here because if we click on these elements, we can see that nothing happens. And if we go to the final version, we can see that when we hover over this element, we can clearly see that this is a button. We have a different color for the button. We have the pointer cursor. And if you look at the bottom left corner, you'll see that there's a link. So this is actually a link to Facebook. Of course, this is not linking to any profile in specific because this is just an example, but there's a link to Facebook here. If we click this element, we can see that we go to Facebook. So let's add these links. So let's go to the HTML file, and we know that we can have any HTML element inside links. So we can have plain text, but we can also have other HTML elements like images. So all we have to do is just put an anchor tag around these images. So we have one example here that we can use. So around the image elements, don't forget to place the closing tag in the correct position after the end of the image. Like this. We can do the same thing for the one below. So here it is. Just do this carefully. Now, not to duplicate the closing tag, we can delete this one. So let's just confirm we have it open in here. Same thing for both lines. And we have both lines with the closing tag, which is good. Let's just adjust the websites. So just as an example, this is going to be linkedin.com. And this is going to be facebook.com. Saving this, going back to the page, let's refresh. And now we can see that we have the pointer cursor, which is good. And this is because the default cursor for links is the pointer one. This is why we didn't have to change it. You can see that on the links in the middle of the text, the same thing is happening. So this is set by default. If you want to add to other elements, let's say you wanted to add them to the P element. Of course, don't do that because we only use the pointer cursor for buttons to let the user know that thing is clickable. But I just wanted to show you how to use it. So you can set cursor to pointer. And now you can see that when we hover over the P elements, we change the cursor. You have many other different options for the cursors. So let's say wait. Let's see what happens. This is the waiting cursor. So if you want to research more about types of cursor, you can just type CSS cursor property on Google. Let's remove this one. We can just uncheck this. And now we have the links. Let's see if they are working. Clicking here, we went to LinkedIn, which is good. Now, one last thing we need to do with them is changing the color. So as you can see, when we hover over them, we have a slide changing color. And in our version, this is not happening. This is because we didn't set the properties for the hover state yet. Let's do that in the next video because to do this, I need to speak to you about pseudo-elements and pseudo-classes. So I'll see you then. Hey everyone, in this video, we're going to speak about pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements so we can set the hover state of our element. So let's remember that when we hover over these images, we have a slight change in the opacity. So how do we set that using CSS? Let's search for CSS Pseudo-Classes. Let's go to W3 Schools. And here we can see that a pseudo-class is used to define a special state of an element. So this is exactly what we want to do. We want to set a different state when we hover over an element. So here we have two simple examples. If we hover over this button, we can see that the color changes from green to blue. And here, the example is the focus. So hovering over this element, nothing happens. But if we select it, which means we are focusing on it, as you can see, it changes the background color. And how do we do that? We use the colon to separate the name of the pseudo class. So here, let's see some examples. We have a pseudo class for unvisited and visited links. We have the mouse over, which is exactly the one we are looking for right now, which is the hover state. We also have active, so you can see more examples here. The one we are looking for right now is the hover state. We're going to speak about more pseudo classes while we progress in the course. So let's just go back there. Let's go to the styles and let's remember that we have the social links. So let's just copy all this. And now we can define the style for every A element that has an image inside it. So it's every image inside A elements, and this is exactly how we did in the HTML. So inside the post author, we have social links, we have an A, and we have images inside. So here we're being very specific. Post author, social links, A image. And now, how do we set a hover state for them? We're just going to use the colon, and here we can't use spaces. So Visual Studio Code is giving us some suggestions, but what we want here is the hover state. And now what we can do is just set a lower opacity. This is something that's not defined in the prototype, but this is what I used in the original version. So opacity 0.7 is just going to make it a bit lighter. So if we save this and we go back there, let's refresh the page. And now when we hover over the images, we can see that we are changing opacity. Let's see that other example. Of course, we don't have that in our original version, but if you want to change the background color for when we focus on this input, what we could do is let's just quickly do this as an example. We can say that every input that we have. And now let's not forget the pseudo class of focus. This is going to be a different background color. So this is going to be, let's say, black, just so we can see it better. All right, let's save this. Now, if we refresh the page, we can see that now we are changing the styles for the focus state. So when we focus this element, it changes the background color. When we unfocus from this element, then we change it back to normal. So this was just an example. We are not going to apply this for now. So now the hover effect is done. Before we move on, let's just speak quickly about pseudo elements as well. We're not going to use this for now, but just so you know that it exists. So sometimes instead of just seeing the column like this, you are going to see the two columns. And maybe you'll be wondering if this is not correct, if this is a pseudo class. So this is not a pseudo class, this is a pseudo element. And the way we use this is similar, but this is used to style specific parts of an element. So for example, if we want to style only the first letter or line of an element, we can use the first line pseudo element. So let's copy this just so we can see this example. Let's say that for the first lines of all the piece, we want to apply a different style. So we can do something like main P and then use the pseudo element of first line. And then maybe we could change the color to something, just as an example, let's say brown. Let's save this. And if we refresh the page, we are now changing the first lines of all the P elements. And these are behaving just like HTML elements. That's why they are pseudo elements and not pseudo classes. We can also do the same thing for the first letter. This is something that is common in newspapers. So for the first letter, they have it very big or even with a different font. So let's change the font size to, let's say, 32 pixels. If we go back there, we can see that now we changed the size of only the first letters of each paragraph. If you go here, you see other examples of how you can use this. There's also the before and after pseudo elements that are very popular, but I don't want to go into this right now because I don't want to overwhelm you with this. We are going to have more opportunities of learning more about pseudo elements. So let's go back and remove this. So we can remove the pseudo element for the first letter. So now that we know how to change the styles for the hover state, let's also work on this button down here, because you can see that this is not changing cursor and there's just this default hover state. But if we go to the final version, you see that that's a very different button. And there's also this change of background color on hover state and the change of the cursor. So let's work on that in the next video. I'll see you then. Bye-bye. Hey everyone, in this video we're going to style our login section. Now that we know how to do the hover effect, we can do it just like we have it here. So let's style this button a bit and then add this different background color for the hover state. So going back to our HTML, this is the area for the login. So right here, I'm going to add a parent element just so we can have this section separate inside a specific class. So let's add a div with a class of login area. Let's select everything, press Alt and use the arrow keys to place them inside this element. Pretty cool. So now we can go to the styles and we have a button inside. Right before the footer, we can have the main, and then inside we have a login area. Or if you don't want to put it inside the main because maybe you want to reuse this login area inside different elements, this time you don't have to refer to the main. You can just use the login area. And inside we have a button. And now we can start styling this button. Now first, let's go to the prototype to see the basic styles of it. So clicking here, we can see we have this background color. So let's copy this to get started with. We also have, let's just change to inspect so we can see it better. We also have border radius of 8 pixels and we have the width and the height. We don't need left or top, but let me just copy everything so it's easier and then we can adjust. So going back there, let's space all this. And now we don't need top or left. So we have width, height, the background color, and border radius. Let's see how this is looking. Let's refresh the page. Now this is looking better. Of course, we need to remove the border. So let's do this now. So let's use border none. All right, so this is now looking like the prototype. As you can see, we don't have a specific border. We just have the border radius. So we just did it right here. So this is looking more like the prototype. Let's just check the font size real quick. If we click on it, see, this is 16 pixels. So let me just copy this. And here, this is going to be the font size for the button itself. So we can set it to 16 pixels. Let's see if we see any difference. Now we can see that this is a bit bigger. So this is looking good. Now we can just adjust some of the margins here. And let's see if the size of this small element is correct. So here we have the font size of 13.33 pixels. Let's see what do we have here. For this element, we have 13. So let's adjust this. And let's also add the margin. So the margin here is going to be 14 pixels for the small. So let's do that right now. So inside the login area, we have a small element. And it has a font size of 13 pixels, line height of 18. Now, if we go back to the HTML, you will see that we actually use the line break here. And again, as I've said before, this is not something that we should do very often. In this case, it was just easier to do this. But now, again, we need to set a specific margin for this. And this could be a bit hard with the BR. Because let's just make a test here for the small. Let's just add a lot of margin button for this. Let's say 100 pixels. Let's save this. And if we go back there, you can see that we are not seeing any margins. And this is because this element is inline. And for inline elements, we can't set the margin bottoms. To do that, this element must be a block element. So instead of doing like we did with the BR, let's remove the BR. And instead, let's make that small element a block element because we don't want it to share the line with any other element. So we can be block. So display block. And now if we do this and we go back there, let's save this. We can see that now we are seeing the 100 pixel margin. So of course, this is not what we want. We just want 14 pixels. Let's go back there. And now it's looking more like the final version. Now let's just see the space that we have above here. So we have 34 pixels. And again, let's add this as a padding top for this area, so it's more consistent. So for the login area, let's just copy all this. Now we just want for the login area, and we are going to set a padding top of 34 pixels. Let's do this and see what happens. Refresh the page, and now we have the space we need. As you can see, we added 34 pixels above it, and this is exactly what we wanted to happen. Now, before we finish, it's time for us to set the cursor, because as you can see, this doesn't have a pointer cursor by default, and also the hover effect. So going back to Visual Studio Code, for the button, we don't need to set the cursor for a specific state, because in the end, every time we hover over the button, we want the cursor to change immediately. So we can set in the button itself, so cursor pointer, save this. Let's see if something changed. Now we can see the cursor. Again, this is something that people often overlook. They think, oh, it's not that important, but trust me, for UX, this is very, very important that you show the user that something is clickable. Even if it's something obvious like a button like this, but you should always change the cursor when something is clickable. Now let's see the hover effect. Again, we don't have any indications in this prototype, and this is my bad, but we can just inspect the final version. For the next projects, I'm going to make an artboard just for defining the hover states. This is something that if you work with a designer, the designer should do this. So let's go to the final version. We can select the button, and now there's a little trick that you can use here. If you select this hover, and then you select hover, you can see that now we see the style for the hover state. This is very useful, so we can have the CSS for this, and as you can see, it's just background color and color. Let's copy all this. Again, we are not going to use all those selectors, but just to make it easier. Let's go back to the CSS, paste this, and now let's just make it just like the one above. So login area button. And with the hover state, let's save this. And if we hover over it, we have the pointer cursor, and also we see the different background color. All right, pretty cool. This is looking good now. Now before we finish the main section, we just need to adjust this list, because if we go to the final version, you can see that we have more space between the elements, and we also have all the list items aligned to the left. And in our version, we have some margins before them that we need to remove. So let's work on that in the next video. I'll see you then. Hey everyone, in this video we're going to style this list so we can finish the main section. So the first thing we need to do is add some space between the elements. So if we look at the final version, you can see that we have more spaces between lines. So let's go to the prototype, and we need to be a bit careful here. Again, as I've said before, the prototype is very good to give us an idea of things. And for stuff like colors and font sizes, we can just copy and paste things. But in some other situations, we just need to adjust. Sometimes we need to make some calculations. And this is more or less what we're going to have to do here. Because if we select these elements, we can see that the designer included all of them in the same text box. So we don't know the margins. All we know here is that we have a font size of 16 and a line height of 36. And this is why we are seeing this space between the list items. But there's a problem in doing this, and let's see what it is. So I'm just going to copy everything. Let me copy the font weight as well. We don't need to worry about color because we already defined it for all the HTML elements. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let me check the HTML file. We have this UL inside the main, so probably we can just add to all UL so they all look the same. So inside the main, let's go up a bit. Let's go back to the main. Inside the main, we have a UL, and now we are setting the styles for the allies, and let's just paste the properties that we copied. So font weight, font size, and line height. Let's save this and let's see how this looks. All right, now it seems to be better, but I don't like using the line height for the separation of the LIs. And the reason for this is that, let's say we have a longer text. So I'm just going to copy this just to use as an example, just to simulate. And these are the things that we need to try to predict. Let's say we have a list item with a lot more text. So let me just copy the text right here so we can see how this looks. And now, as you can see, this is not very good because this is all part of the same list item. And if we add spaces like this, it's just confusing. We don't know what's part of this list item and what is a different one. Of course, we have the bullet points, but this is not ideal. The ideal thing would be to follow that 6 pixels rule. So instead of having, let's select the LI, instead of having the line height as 36, we would still have it as, in this case, 22. And then we could just add some margin bottoms to each of the LIs. And this way, it's going to be way better to differentiate them. So let's try that. Going back to the HTML. So let's just leave it here so we don't forget the value we had. So instead of 36, let's use 22. So we are going to have 6 pixels of line height, which, like I said, it's the average line height used for text. And now we're going to add the difference between 22 and 36 as margin bottom. So here we have 14 pixels of difference. So we are going to add this difference as a margin bottom. So by doing this, let's save. Now we have the correct spacings because of the margin, but if we have a lot of text, so let's try to do that again. Let's just copy the LI. Let's simulate an LI with lots of text. So now, as you can see, it's way better to differentiate this from the other bullet points because we have only 6 pixels of space between the lines, but between elements we have 14 pixels. So this is much better for the eye. This is something that, like I said, it's not always going to be very clear on the design, but it's very important to you as a web developer to predict these situations and speak to the designer on how to solve this. This is something that probably, if this was a real life project, I would just suggest these numbers and just send a link for the designer to validate and check if this is fine. I think this is looking good. So the only thing we still need to do here is removing this margin. Let's see where this is coming from. So if we select the element, we can select the LI. We can see that there's nothing here. So there's no margin or padding there. But if we select the UL, we can see that there's that green area. That's the default padding for the UL element. So if we set the padding to 0, we can see that now that space disappeared. But this is still not what we're looking for because now we can see that the bullet points are more to the left. They are not aligned to the rest of the text. And in the final version, they are all aligned. This is something that's easy to fix. There is a list style position property, and we just need to set it to inside. If we do this, then the bullet points will be aligned with the text. So we can just copy this. And here we need to paste this in the UL. So main UL. So we change the padding. We change the list style position. So going back there, let me refresh the page. Now this is looking exactly like I wanted it to look. And just one thing I wanted to show you is that there is another property called list style type. If instead of having the bullet points, you want other symbols, you can see that you can change to square. You can remove them completely by setting it to none. We're going to have to do that with the list of links because they don't have bullet points. And you have a few other options like this. You can also set your own custom images for the bullet points, but we are not going to get into that topic now. So I just wanted to show you that you can use this. Okay, so now everything's looking good with this list in the end of the project, we are going to review the whole page again to see if we missed anything in terms of font sizes, colors, margins. But for now, I consider this to be finished, the main section. So we are ready to start with the footer. And this is the subject of the next video. I'll see you then. Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to start working in the footer section. We still have some things to do, so it looks just like the final version. So we need to style this list of links like this, removing the bullet points, changing the colors. We also have this form field and also this all rights reserved, which has a different background. So let's start working on all these things right now. So let's start with the list of links. Let me go to Visual Studio Code. This is inside the footer and we have a UL. So since we only have one list inside the footer, we can just do it like this. So footer UL. If that was not the case, it would be good to add a class to this list. So let's remember that we have one property called list style type. And if we set this to none, let's see how it looks. We were now able to remove them, but we still have this padding, which we don't want. And let's remember from the previous list that if we select the UL itself, you see that we have some paddings here. So if we set the padding to 0, now this is aligned exactly the way we want. So let's go back there and let's also set the paddings to 0. Okay, and now the spacings between lines is also different. So let's inspect this to see what do we have here. So we have a list item with a margin bottom of 12 pixels. So let's add that as well. So in this case, it's for every list item, not to the list itself. So footer UL li. So margin bottom, 12 pixels. Okay, now this is starting to look more like the prototype. So let's now select this list of items and let's see the color of the text. We can just go here to inspect and then we can see that we have this color for the link. So let's just add to each of the LIs. This is starting to look much better now, but note that here we have the links with a color and the underline with a different color. If we go to the final version or the prototype, you will see that we have both with the same color. That's because we only applied it to the li, but not to the links. So if we select this element, you will see that the li has the blue color that we just set, but the A that is around it has this color. So we just have to go back there and set the same color for the links. So we can just do this. Let's remember that the links are outside the li, so we can remove the li from here. And we don't need to set the margin bottom here, just the color. And by doing this, now we have the same color for both the text and the underline. Now let's see if the fonts are correct. So going to the prototype, we have the read more. Let's go to inspect at the right side. So we have the font size at 18. In this case, let's try changing it here to 18 to see if there's any difference. You can see that it was actually a bit bigger. So this is something that it's important to do for both the H3s inside the footer. So let's do that now. If we go back to the HTML, you see that both the read more and the subscribe are H3s. So going back here, we can change all the H3s inside the footer. So footer, H3, font size, 18 pixels. And another thing that's still missing here is that we don't have any paddings here. And if you go to the prototype, you will see that we have 50 pixels at the top. Let's see at the bottom. We also have 50 pixels. So we just need to set the paddings on top and bottom. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. That's going to be on the footer itself. So padding. Let's use the shorthand property. And let's remember that if we use only two values, the first one is going to be for top and bottom. So we can set it to 50 pixels. And the second one is going to be to right and left. So we can set it to 0. Let's save this. Going back there. Now there is one problem here. At the top, we can see that the padding has been added correctly, but at the bottom, it has been added to the end, and that's not what we want. If we go back here, you see that we want the padding before this blue element. And this happened because if we go back to Visual Studio Code and look at the structure of it, you see that we have everything inside the footer. So one thing we can do here, of course, in a more complex project, you could define different classes. You could place this element outside the footer, but for now, this is fine because we have a section here with the class of page container, and this element is outside of that page container. So what we could do here in this simple example is just instead of setting the paddings to the footer, we can set the paddings to that page container. So we can just do section dot page container. Let's just copy this, because we want to keep the background color where it was before. So to the footer. And here for the page container, we are just going to set the padding. So if we do this and go back there, let's save this. Now you can see that we were able to add the padding to the correct location. So the padding is before that last element. So now this is looking just like the prototype, which is what we need. And the fact that this element is outside of the page container is good because when we set the background color of it, this is going to cover the whole screen. So let's make a test here. Let's add a class of copyright. Now let's go to styles and let's add footer and then a div with a class of copyright. Now let's go back to the prototype to see the color of this. So this is the color. Let's just copy the color code. Go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's set the background color to that X code. Now refreshing the page, now we have the background correctly set. Let's not worry about the color, the alignment of the text right now and the size of it. We are going to do this on a separate video. For now, we can see that this element is now correctly separated from the rest of the footer. We have the padding set at the correct place. This is all good for now. In the next video, we are going to style this form field. I'll see you then. Hey there, welcome back. In this video, we're going to work on the subscription form. So let's go to the prototype to see how it looks. As you can see, we have a bigger height for both the form field and the go button. We also have a padding here. If we go back to the original version, you see that when we click here, this is almost touching the borders. And right here, we have a little space. So if you select the text, you see that we have 12 pixels of padding. So let's set this now. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's see how is the structure of it. So we have a form inside the footer. If you want, you can just add a new class for this. So let's add a class of subscription form or newsletter, whatever you feel it's the most appropriate class for this. So let's just copy this. This is just because like we did with the UL, I don't like doing this much because if we add another UL, then we have to go back there and change everything we did. So in this case, instead of adding to the form itself, I'm just going to add a class to the form. So let's go to the styles. Let's add footer, form, and in this case, no space here because the subscription form is the class of the form element. So we don't have to add spaces here. And now let's go back there and let's see what we have. So we have two inputs. One is the email and the other one is the submit. And there is one type of selector that we can use for this kind of thing. So whenever we have like different attributes, we can have selectors for specific attributes. So if we go to the input, let's just make a test here. If we add an input here and we add, let's add something bigger just so we can see what's going to happen. So if we add a padding of, let's say, instead of 12, let's add 30 just so we can see it better. So 30 pixels and 0. Actually, it's the opposite. It's 0 to the top and bottom and 30 to right and left. Let's add this, and going back there, you can see that now we added not only to the form field, but also to the go button, and that's not necessarily what we want. So what we can do here, instead of having to add a class again, since we already have different types for each of them, we can use this as a selector. So how do we do this? We can add braces, and then we could just do it like this. So we are just going to add this style to the input that has a type of email, and that's going to work for every attribute you have for HTML element. So let's save this. Let's refresh here. And now, as you can see, the go button does not have that anymore, and the form field still has it. Pretty good. So now that we know how this works, let's remove 30 pixels and let's leave only 12. Going back there. And now this has the spacing that we needed to have. So let's go to the prototype and let's see what's the height of this. So the height is 54, and this is for both the input fields. So we can add this to both. So here we can just copy this. The height is going to be 54 pixels. And here we can remove the type because this is for both inputs. Let's save this. Refreshing the page, you can see that now both have the correct height. It seems that there's some difference here, but we're going to fix this in a moment. First, let's see the size of the go button. I don't think the width is correct here. So width is 94 pixels. So let's copy this. And let's add the width only to the go button. So going to Visual Studio Code. Let me just leave it here. And I'm going to open this for the type submit. So as you can see, we can add specific things for each of the form fields by using the type to differentiate them. And here, we're going to add the width of 94 pixels. Saving this, going back there, now we have the button with the correct width. Let's see the form field also because this doesn't seem right. So the width of this one is 394. So for the email one, we have a width of 394. Let's save this. Going back there, we can see that now both of them have the correct width and the correct height. Now let's adjust font sizes and colors. So going to the prototype, let's see what we have here. Let's select this one first. We can see that the size is 16. So let's see the CSS. We have font weight 400. We don't have to change this. We just need the font size. Let's see if it's the same thing for the go button. As you can see, 16. So in this case, we can just add to the input because both of them have the same size. And one different thing here is that this go button is actually in caps. So what we could do, but we shouldn't, but let me show you what we could do, is just come in here and changing the value to go with both letters capitalized. And if we did that, you can see that it seems to be sorted, but the bad thing here is that if we want to add a different text, then we're gonna have to always type in bold. If we have a website with multiple languages, we're gonna have to make sure that the translations are also in caps. So that's not the best way of doing this. Let's go back to where it was before. Let's refresh the page. So the best way of doing this is using CSS. So we can go to the submit and we can add the text transform property and we can change this to uppercase. So by doing this, refreshing the page, you can now see that this is always going to be uppercase. It doesn't matter if we have different languages, if we want to change the text, this is always going to be uppercase. So every time you need to do something like this, it's better to use CSS rather than changing the original text. Now let's check the colors. So starting with the placeholder, we can see that we have an RGBA. This is using transparency. I don't like to do this because if we have elements behind it, maybe we're going to be able to see it, because what we're doing with RGBA is making this text with 50% transparency. But for this simple example, it's fine. Normally in a bigger project, I would call the attention of the designer to actually set a plain gray color with an X code. But in this case, it's fine. Let's just use this. So going back to Visual Studio Code, this is only for the email type. So we can set the color to this. And let's also see for the go, as you can see, this is black. Let's just confirm it. So yeah, it's 000. Let's just copy this. And this one is going to be only for the submit type. And also the background color. So we can see the background. Let's just copy this. So let's add the background color property, refreshing the page. This is starting to look better, but the problem here is that we don't want this black border. If we go back to the prototype, you see that we don't have that black border, which means that we just need to set the border to the same color as the background. So here, let's add a border and let's use 1 pixel, solid, and then we're just going to use the same color. Let's do the same thing for the other input, because we want to make sure that this is consistent. Let's just confirm if that's the actual color. So if we select the text field, you see that actually we have a 1 pixel border, but the color is different. So let's just copy this. And this is going to be for the email type. So refreshing the page, now this is starting to look much more like the prototype. Now just one small thing before we finish. I don't like something we did here and I'm going to show you what it is. So if we select this email field, remember that we set the color to 0.5. Instead of doing that, let me change this to 0.2 just to show you something. So now, as you can see, we changed the color of the actual text of that input. And that's not the intention of the designer. Of course, if that was a real life project, we would have to contact the designer so we could confirm what is the color of the placeholder text and what is the color of the actual input. Because what we did here was changing the color of the input. And normally what we do is having a light gray for the placeholder text and a plain black color for the email itself. So the user knows the difference between what is a placeholder and what is the actual email address. So what we can do here is just going back to Visual Studio Code, and here, let me just copy this whole thing. Let's just leave the color. And instead of adding that transparency to the input, let's use the placeholder selector. So we can just add the 2 columns, and then this is going to be applied only for the placeholder. For the email itself, we could just use the color code for plain black, and that's going to make a lot of difference. Let's save this. Going back there, saving this, you can see that now we have a light gray placeholder, but when we actually start typing the email, this is plain black. And this is good for UX because that's clear for the user that this is an email that has been typed and this is a placeholder. All right, now just one last thing we need to do to finish this section is setting a different margin for this H3, because if we go to the prototype, you will see that we have more space between these elements. If you hover over the element above, you see that we have a distance of 40 pixels. So we could set to the H3, but the problem is that if we set to the H3, then this is going to be applied for this one as well. Of course, we have CSS selectors we can use to set it only for the first element or the last element. But here there's an easier way to do this because we have this list and we can just set 40 pixels of margin below the list. So going back to Visual Studio Code, we already have some styles for the UL. So what we can do is just setting margin bottom to 40 pixels. Let's save this. And now we can see that we have that spacing correct. Pretty cool. So in the next video, we are going to style the copyright area. I'll see you then. Bye-bye. Hey everyone, in this video, we're going to style the copyright area. So going to the prototype, let's see what we have here. We can see that the text is white, so 6 times F. The font size is 16 and it's center aligned. So let's adjust that now. We already started the styles for this element up here, so we can just set the styles for this copyright div. So the font size is 16 pixels. The color is white. Again, if you want to use the Xcode, it's fine. If you want to use the color name, is also fine. Like I mentioned, when it's white or black, I don't mind using the color name. Just for other colors, it's better to use either the Xcode or the RGB code or RGBA. So for this, since it's white, I just think it's easier to use the color name. Let's also change the text align to center and refreshing the page. Now this is looking better. We still need to add the paddings. We can see that we have 25 pixels of paddings at the top and at the bottom. So let's add that now. So padding. 25, top and bottom, 0, left and right. Save this, refreshing the page. Now we have the correct paddings. Now there's just one thing missing here. If you go to the prototype, you can see we have this symbol that we could just copy from here and paste on the HTML. Let's see if this is gonna work. So we could just paste the symbol here, refresh the page. As you can see, the symbol is showing here, but this is not the correct way of using symbols. The correct way is using HTML entities. This is because we need to make sure that this is going to be correct in all browsers. There's not going to be any problem rendering these symbols. So if you search on Google for HTML entities, let's go to W3 schools. Let's just go down here. You can see that we have some examples of HTML entities and how to use them. So if you want to add the less than and greater than symbol, you need to use an HTML entity, because remember that we use these symbols for HTML tags. So if you want to include this in the middle of the text and you just type this is going to be confusing for the browser and you could have unexpected results. So if you wanted to use this symbol, the best way would be to use the HTML entity. And to do this, you just have to copy the code that starts with this and symbol. Every time you see something that starts with the and symbol, you can just copy this and just paste it in the HTML code. You will see that Visual Studio Code is going to color this differently, telling us that this is an HTML entity. So for this example, we're looking for this registered trademark symbol. You can use either the entity number or the entity name. It doesn't make any difference. Let's test both. So I'm just going to copy this one. You can see that both start with the and symbol. So going back there, instead of just pasting the symbol here, we could have problems by doing this. We are just going to paste the HTML entity. As you can see, Visual Studio Code colored this the same way as an HTML element. So it's identifying that this is an HTML entity. So let's save this. Let's go back there. And if we refresh the page, you can see that now we have the symbol correctly showing. Let's also make a test with the number. So as you can see, same result, and now we have the symbol we were looking for. So again, every time you are going to use symbols, so not letters, but symbols like greater than, less than symbols, the and symbol, even quotation marks, single or double quotation marks, currency symbols, and all of these examples, you should use HTML entities instead of just pasting the symbol in the code. So now let me just copy this. I just think it's more clear what this entity is when we use the name. It's better to understand what this is rather than the code. So I'm just going to use this one. Let me just replace it right here. Now let's just refresh the page to see if this is still working. This is fine. So we are almost done with this, but let's remember that higher up the page, we already had a symbol. Let's remember that we added this bullet point to separate the author name from the last update. And let's go back to the HTML to see how we did that. So let's go up and find that section. So here's the author section. You can see that we actually pasted the bullet point here. And again, this is not the correct way of doing this. Even though it's working, this could cause problems on different browsers. So it's the safest thing you can do is always search for the HTML entity. If you don't find it in that basic list, it's very easy to find it on Google. So let's go to W3 Schools. As you can see, this is not here, but you can just search on Google for bullet point HTML entity. As you can see, it's showing right here. We don't even have to go inside. So let's just copy this, go to the HTML. Instead of just pasting the symbol, let's paste the code for the HTML entity. Now let's go back there. Let's refresh the page. So as you can see, it's the same thing, but now we are making sure that this is gonna be rendered correctly in all browsers. All right, so now we are officially done with our first project. This is looking beautiful, just like the final version, just like the prototype we had. When you work with real life projects, you are going to receive this prototype from a designer. So you just learned how to use it, how to get the CSS properties you need in order to build, to give life to this web page. So I hope you liked this section. I hope you were able to learn a lot on how to get started with HTML and CSS to build websites. If you have any questions, any doubts, do not hesitate to get in touch. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.